Chapter 1243. Qin Chuan looked at Vio, who was explaining seriously. He chuckled and said, "Don't take it seriously. I was just joking. But it seems like you don't find this joke very funny." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Vio looked at Qin Chuan with a complicated look and said, "You repelled the Demon King's will." Qin Chuan nodded and replied, "Many people saw it. To be honest, I was just lucky." Qin Chuan wasn't being modest. He was indeed lucky to be able to repel the Demon King's will. If he were to do it again, he might not succeed. Whether it was luck or not, in short, you did it. Vio looked at Qin Chuan and said, "Since your arrival, the front line that hadn't been able to obtain any victory has obtained 2 victories in a row. This has raised the morale of the soldiers. Now, your heroic deeds are spreading everywhere. Miraculous youth, heroic demon slayer." Qin Chuan grinned and said, "In other people's eyes, I have always been good at creating miracles." Vio was silent for a moment and asked, "Are you going to leave the front line?" Qin Chuan looked at Vio and asked, "Is my performance so obvious? Can you stay?" Vio whispered, "The front line needs you. Everyone needs you." Qin Chuan looked at Vio with a subtle look and said, "Give me a reason to stay. Now, you are no longer a person. You have become a label. All the soldiers in the front line believe that as long as you are in the front line, the demons won't be able to break through our defensive line and take advantage of us. It's no exaggeration to say that you are the morale of the army." Vio looked at Qin Chuan and couldn't help but sigh. He really didn't expect that Qin Chuan's arrival would have such a miraculous effect. He had stabilized the morale of the army and raised the morale of the soldiers. 2 consecutive victories in addition to the fact that Qin Chuan had repelled the Demon King's will in front of everyone. This had raised the image of Qin Chuan in the hearts of the soldiers in the front line. If Qin Chuan were to leave the front line now, it would certainly cause a huge blow to the morale of the soldiers. Once the morale was damaged, the demons would attack again. Maybe the defensive line would collapse. Vio didn't dare to take this risk. Therefore, he chose to take the initiative and earnestly asked Qin Chuan to stay in the front line. After hearing Vio's words, Qin Chuan was slightly stunned. He looked at Vio and said, "I feel that you are flattering me. Is flattery. No, I'm telling the truth. You can ask the people around you who you trust to inquire about it. Perhaps they already know about it." The demons didn't know. In the past 3 days, the demons SSS have SSS the S assessed. Qin Chuan was silent for a moment, then said, "We humans have an idiom. Maybe you've heard of it before. Honest." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Vio's expression slightly changed, but he didn't say anything. Qin Chuan saw that Vio didn't reply, so he faintly smiled and said, "Maybe you're right. Mize. But I'm afraid that's not what you want to see. What you're really worried about is the incoming Zerg's army." Qin Chuan sat up straight. He looked at Vio with bright eyes and said, "Once Zerg's army enters the Deus cluster, they'll definitely join forces with the Zerg's fleet that's already infiltrated the Deus cluster. They'll create chaos within the Deus cluster and shake the people's morale. If news of this spreads to the front line, it'll definitely affect the morale of the front line. The Nephilim's army will be in a state of panic. The Nephilim's army will only need one attack to break through your defense line. So, you want me to stay and guard the front line for you. You want me to buy you enough time to quell the chaos brought by Zerg and maintain the rule of the one God religion, right?" Faced with Qin Chuan's aggressive questioning, Vio finally couldn't keep silent anymore. He said in a low voice, "Protecting the Deus cluster is also a good thing for you. Controlling the war at the front line is beneficial to the development of both the humans and the demons. What you said is very reasonable. I know that. That's why I came to the front line and fought bravely." At this point, Qin Chuan's gaze suddenly turned sharp, piercing straight into Wei's heart. If you told me the key points directly and told me what you're thinking, maybe I'd choose to stay. But you didn't do that. You chose to use the power of public opinion to oppress me. You used people's hearts to restrain me. You're scheming against me. Faced with Qinchuan's merciless exposure, Vio could no longer maintain his calm expression. He looked at Qinchuan with a flustered look. He opened his mouth but couldn't say a word. Looking at the expression on Vio's face, Qinchuan took a deep breath and said, "Vio, you're the cardinal of the one-God religion. You care about the one-God religion and want to maintain the rule of the one-God religion and protect the Deus cluster. I can understand your feelings, but why can't you talk about some things openly? We're allies now, aren't we? But is your attitude toward me really the attitude toward an ally?" Hearing Qinchuan's words, Vio's face couldn't help but reveal a touch of guilt. He said, "Sorry, really? I'm very sorry." Qinchuan sighed and said, "Do you know? I've never regretted killing Province, nor did I regret killing the 300 oracles in the ancient demon ruins. I also didn't regret killing Sam. That was what I had to do on my way to Rise. At that time, whether it was the one-God religion, the demon race, Zerg, or even the Tian people who stood in my way, I would have killed them all, by hook or by crook, without showing any mercy. Now, in the face of external threats, I don't want to hear the saying that one must first pacify the internal situation in order to deal with external threats. If you really treat me, Qinchuan, the human race, and the demon race as your allies, then I will do my best to help you get through this difficult time. But if you deliberately plot against me and use me, then I'm sorry. No matter how your life or death affects me, I won't do anything for you. This is my attitude. Go back and tell the Pope, or even your Divine Master, that I'll be waiting for your reply." After saying this, Qinchuan closed his eyes slightly and lost interest in continuing the conversation with Vio. Vio stood up and bowed deeply to Qinchuan. When he got up, his face was covered in tears. Qinchuan's sincerity and frankness made Vio feel extremely ashamed of his previous behavior. Chapter 1244. After Vio left, Lu Zi returned to the bedroom. She looked at Qinchuan and hesitated to speak. Qinchuan saw the hesitant look on Lu Zi's face and smiled. "Do you think we shouldn't stay?" Lu Zi pursed her lips and said, "From the overall situation, we should stay and contribute to the resistance against the Nephilim race. However, this is too dangerous for you. You know that both Zerg and the Nephilim race view you as a thorn in their side. They want to get rid of you as soon as possible. The one-God religion also has a grudge against you. If you stay in such a chaotic place, there's a high chance that an accident will happen." Lu Zi's worries were not unfounded. After the two wars, Qinchuan not only caused the Nephilim race to suffer heavy losses, but he also repelled the Nephilim king's phantom. The Nephilim race must hate Qinchuan to the bone. If a full-scale war broke out, Qinchuan would definitely become the Nephilim race's primary target once he appeared on the battlefield. On the other hand, the hatred between the human race, the demon race, and Zerg that had lasted since ancient times had long made them mortal enemies. After Zerg's troops invaded the Deus cluster, if they had the chance to encounter Qinchuan, they would definitely not let him off easily. Finally, Qinchuan's relationship with the one-God religion was not good. If Qinchuan was besieged by the enemy and needed help, the one-God religion might not lend a helping hand. It would be good enough if they did not kick him when he was down. In summary, Lu Zi believed that Qinchuan should leave the front line as soon as possible and return to Stansos. Even if he wanted to participate in the war, he should act with the more trustworthy Tian people. Participating in the war from the border of the deity planet was the best choice. He could fight with all his might while protecting himself as much as possible. Qinchuan was well aware of Lu Zi's worries, but the current situation was very complicated. "Little Z, you know my original plan. I wanted to stay for another 10 days before leaving." Qinchuan sighed helplessly and said to Lu Zi, But if I leave, once the demons break through the front line of defense and join the chaotic battle within the Deus cluster prematurely, the situation will be very disadvantageous to us. But have you ever thought that as long as there's life, there's hope? Lu Zi frowned. You should be more selfish. I'm sorry. Qin Chuan looked at Lu Zi. If the answer from the one God religion satisfies me, I would like to stay. Lu Zi helplessly looked at Qin Chuan and said, All right, if you want to stay, then we'll stay. Don't tell us to leave first, I don't want to hear that. Upon hearing this, Qin Chuan looked at Lu Zi with touched eyes and said, Thank you for supporting my decision at all times. In Qin Chuan's impression, ever since he met Lu Zi, whenever there was a difference of opinion between them, Lu Zi would always give in at the end, accommodate him, and support him, even if sometimes his decision did not seem right. Such firm trust and support really touched Qin Chuan. I can't help it. I'm your girlfriend after all. Lu Zi looked at Qin Chuan and smiled. All right, don't say anything emotional. I don't like it. Upon hearing this, Qin Chuan smiled and said, Let's not talk about it now. After everything comes to a conclusion, we'll find a quiet place to live in seclusion. I'll tell you slowly for the rest of my life. That's so mushy. Lu Zi gave Qin Chuan a disdainful look, then got up and walked out of the bedroom. It could be seen that she was in a good mood. After Vio returned to the command center, he sent the text of the conversation between himself and Qin Chuan to Pope Saint Baudelo. After seeing the conversation between Vio and Qin Chuan, Saint Baudelo could not help but fall into a long silence. Today's Deus cluster seemed to have kept the Nephilim out and defended its rear base camp, but in fact, the current Deus cluster had become a sieve, leaking air everywhere. The infiltration of Zerg's fleet, and even the infiltration of the Void Empire, had made the interior of the Deus cluster extremely unstable. It was foreseeable that when Zerg's fleet arrived in the Deus cluster, a chaotic battle would break out within the Deus cluster. Saint Baudelo was very glad that at the beginning of the war, the Tian people had stood firmly on their side and provided a lot of help to the One God religion. Without the support of the Tian people, the One God religion alone might not have been able to hold on. Now, the One God religion had a new ally, and that was Qin Chuan. Saint Baudelo's feelings toward Qin Chuan were extremely complicated. On the one hand, Qin Chuan had killed many members of the church, and even the higher-ups of the church. They were enemies with Qin Chuan, even mortal enemies. But on the other hand, Qin Chuan was the hero of the front line and the morale of the frontline troop. With Qin Chuan, the morale of the frontline troops was high, and their combat effectiveness could be increased by at least 30%. This was beneficial for them to resist the invasion of the Nephilim race. It could be said that Qin Chuan was a man that Saint Baudelo both loved and hated. Now, Vio had placed a difficult problem in front of Saint Baudelo. Saint Baudelo could either firmly regard Qin Chuan as an enemy, and then sit back and watch Qin Chuan leave the front line, causing turmoil in the front line and creating convenience for the Nephilim race. Or, in order to resist the Nephilim race for a longer time at the front line, and for the stability of the Deus cluster, Saint Baudelo could truly put down the hatred between him and Qin Chuan, and form an alliance with Qin Chuan. Other than this, Saint Baudelo had no better choice. Saint Baudelo hesitated again and again, but in the end, he couldn't make a choice. He decided to tell the Lord of God about this matter, and let the Lord of God make a decision. When Saint Baudelo passed on this difficult choice to the Lord of God, he soon received a reply from the Lord of God. Consider the overall situation. A simple sentence, but it made Saint Baudelo finally make up his mind to put down the hatred between him and Qin Chuan. Vio returned and brought Qin Chuan the reply of Pope Saint Baudelo. In the video, Saint Baudelo looked solemn and said to Qin Chuan in a serious tone, Qin Chuan, in order to jointly resist the Nephilim race, Zerg, and the great cause of the Void Empire, I, Saint Baudelo, on behalf of the One God religion, formally form an alliance with you. From now on, everything in the past will be written off. The video was very brief, and it ended there. Saint Baudelaire didn't say anything particularly inciting, because there was no need. Everyone was not a child, and no one was easy to fool. Qin Chuan smiled and said to Vio, "If you don't mind, please send me a copy of this video. If you go back on your words in the future, I'll have evidence." Vio heard this and asked, "You agree to stay?" "Of course." Qin Chuan grinned. "After all, we are now allies." Chapter 1245. Frontline. Devil Star. Seada was sitting in the command center, looking at the intelligence from the great Devil Star cluster. His gloomy face finally showed a smile. Just yesterday, the military sent news that 2 billion reinforcements had arrived at a place only 3 days away from the front line. Once the war broke out, they could move and join the battlefield at any time. Now everything was ready, except for the east wind. And the east wind they were waiting for would reach the Deus cluster in 7 days. Since the battle between Qin Chuan and the Demon King's shadow, the front line had been quiet for nearly half a month. While the soldiers at the bottom were happy about this, the higher-ups were in a heavy mood. The quieter it was now, the crazier the storm would be when it came. Now, all the higher-ups at the front line knew very well that once Zerg's troops arrived at the Deus cluster, a war could break out at any time. And now they did not have much time left. The Church has mobilized another 300 million troops to the front line this time. 200 million of them have been evenly distributed among the 5 fronts, and the remaining 100 million troops will be used as a mobile force to be deployed to the most critical front line at any time. Vio looked at Qin Chuan, who was sitting beside him, and sighed. He wanted to say something, but stopped. Seeing this, Qin Chuan laughed and said, "You want to tell me that more than 2 billion demons have arrived at the front line, but you're worried that you'll scare me away?" Vio did not expect Qin Chuan to already know this information, but when he thought of the relationship between Qin Chuan and the Tian people, he understood. The Tian people had no reason not to share such important information with Qin Chuan. He smiled bitterly and shook his head, saying, "You misunderstood. I just don't know how to tell you this sad news." The demon race warriors were brave and good at fighting. They could fight 1 against 2 or even 3. The 2 billion troops were comparable to the 3 billion troops of the One God sect, or even more. However, when they faced the 2 billion troops of the demon race, the total number of troops they could mobilize was less than 600 million, including some reinforcements from the divine race. Compared to the demon race, the difference in strength was too great. However, this was not because the One God sect did not want to mobilize more troops to the front line, but because they needed to use more troops to clean up their internal affairs. Qin Chuan looked at Vio curiously and asked, "How many Zerg fleets has Gale destroyed?" Vio replied, "Only 2. These Zerg fleets have already discovered their tracks and are hiding very well. Jiala has already done his best." Qin Chuan nodded and said, "Destroying 1 more Zerg fleet is a good thing. There's another piece of good news that I believe you already know." Vio said to Qin Chuan, "In the past 2 months, the Tian people have gathered another 200 million troops. These 200 million troops will enter the Deus cluster together with Zerg's troops. At that time, if Zerg's troops want to take action, the Tian people will be able to resist them and wait for reinforcements to arrive before wiping out Zerg's troops in one go." Qin Chuan frowned slightly and said, "I think you guys are oversimplifying things. Since Zerg can watch the Tian people gather 200 million troops one after another, it's impossible for them not to take any precautions." Speaking of this, Qin Chuan suddenly asked, "How many days will it take for Zerg's troops to arrive at the Deus cluster? Where will they enter the Deus cluster?" Hearing Qin Chuan's question, Vio replied, "They are still 5 days away from the Deus cluster. They will enter the Deus cluster from the border of the celestial planet." Hearing that, Qin Chuan became silent. After a long while, He suddenly raised his head and looked at Vio, and said in a deep voice, "I suspect that the insectoids will make their move in advance. Those insectoid fleets that have yet to be found and have already snuck in might have already gathered near Heavenly God Planet, preparing to surround and kill the Heaven Race's troops." Hearing Qinchuan's words, Vio was shocked and said, "Are you sure?" Qinchuan pursed his lips and said, "I'm not sure, but we have to tell the Tian people not to let their guard down just because they haven't reached the Deus cluster yet. I understand. Let's use our own methods to inform the Tian people. This way, the Tian people will pay enough attention to this matter." Vio's expression also became serious. If there was a problem with the Tian people's 200 million troops, then things would be troublesome. Under the starry sky, the huge Zerg fleet and the Tian people fleet were moving forward at high speed. They could cross a distance of hundreds of kilometers every second. Thelon joined this fleet as a staff officer in the headquarters. Every day, he was busy making all kinds of statistical predictions, deducing the direction of the war, and analyzing all aspects of the upcoming war with Zerg. He hoped to be more prepared when the war broke out. On this day, as usual, Thelon was analyzing the combat strength of Zerg's troops. At this time, his optical computer suddenly received a message. When he saw the content of the message, his calm face instantly became serious. Thelon put down the work at hand and went straight to the headquarters to find the commander of the fleet, Heavenly King Oliver. "Heavenly King, I just received a message from Qinchuan. He warned us to be careful of Zerg's troops. Zerg's troops are very likely to launch an attack on us in the near future. Moreover, the Zerg fleet that sneaked into the Deus cluster may have already gathered at the border of Celestial Planet. They are preparing to kill us together with this Zerg's troops." Oliver, who was sitting on a chair, heard Thelon's words and said with an indifferent expression, "I also received a reminder from the One God religion just now. The content is the same as what you said. It seems that this matter is most likely true." Thelon immediately said, "In that case, why don't we make the first move?" Oliver shook his head and said, "The alliance has not been established yet. If we make a move against Zerg now, we will be on the passive side in terms of public opinion. We will be suspected and condemned by various forces, so we can only make the first move against Zerg." Hearing Oliver's words, Thelon could not help but frown. He clearly knew that Zerg was up to no good, but he could not make the first move. This feeling was really too sullen. "I know what you are thinking, but since we have chosen to stand on the side of justice, we have a good reason to act. We have to establish the alliance, and lead the alliance. There are some prices that we must pay." Oliver looked at Thelon and said, "You have to understand that the side of justice will always be restrained from all sides. We can never act recklessly. Otherwise, we will be no different from the Nephilim race." Thelon heard this and said in a deep voice, "I know, but," Oliver smiled and said, "Don't worry. With me here, there won't be any problems." Chapter 1246. Year 14. 59 million of the universe calendar. On a sunny September day, Zerg's forces suddenly launched an attack on the Tian people's forces in the celestial cluster's Io star cloud. The flames of war were everywhere in the Io star cloud. What Qinchuan had predicted really happened. With Qinchuan's reminder, the Tian people were fully prepared. They immediately fended off the ferocious attacks from Zerg's forces. However, no matter how much they thought about it, Qinchuan and the Tian clan did not expect that there would be a supreme existence in the crossing calamity stage accompanying them. When the White Army's highest commander, Guru, appeared on the battlefield, the situation instantly became one-sided. The Tian people were utterly defeated. 3 days later, the Tian people were completely defeated. Less than 10% of their 200 million troops were left. Heavenly King Oliver had fallen. The entire world was shocked. Celestial Cluster, Stansos. The 9 elders of the Elder Council were gathered. Everyone's countenance was extremely gloomy and grim. In order to be safe, they had ordered Heavenly King Oliver to accompany the army. However, they had not expected that this decision would cause Heavenly King Oliver to die. "There's a serious error in our intelligence mission," the ninth elder said in a deep voice. "Firstly, we didn't discover that Guru was hiding among Zerg's forces. Secondly, when did Guru advance to the tribulation stage?" No one could answer the ninth elder's question. If they knew the answer to this question, they wouldn't have been in such a terrible state. Heavenly King Oliver had always been the spokesperson of the Tian people. Now that Heavenly King Oliver had fallen, the impact on the Tian people came from all aspects and was extremely huge. Right now, we should think about how we should deal with the problem before us. The seventh elder sighed. Under Guru's lead, Zerg's forces have swept through the Io star cloud and are now pouncing toward the Deus cluster. Right now, the Deus cluster is in imminent danger. The demon race and Zerg's goal was very clear. They wanted to race against time and take down the Deus cluster as quickly as possible. After the Deus cluster fell, they would turn around and attack the celestial cluster. Without the Deus cluster's support, the celestial cluster would not be able to survive alone. Just as the elders were sighing, someone suddenly came over and brought the elders a piece of news. The Naga, the Storm race, the Fire Spirit race, and a few other races have requested an audience with the ninth elder. They wish to renegotiate the Alliance army. Hearing Sharmila's words, the ninth elder immediately became furious. He said, "They still have the face to take the initiative to come here? At that time, when I asked them to join the Alliance army, what did they say? All of them wanted to wait and see, all of them were hesitating. Now that they have seen Zerg destroy our 200 million Tian people's army and Heavenly King Oliver fall, they are finally afraid? They want to join the Alliance army?" Seeing the anger on the ninth elder's face, the person who came sighed helplessly and said, "But no matter what, we must borrow their strength to form the Alliance army." "I know." The ninth elder stood up and said, "I will go look for them." It seemed that the ninth elder intended to vent the anger in his heart on those people. However, the ninth elder couldn't be blamed. Who asked those people to be so shrewd? The fall of Heavenly King Oliver was something that Sharmila absolutely could not accept. He was her most respected and favorite teacher. He was the elder who had accompanied and protected her as she grew up. This matter was really too heavy and too painful for her. Chen Chongqing and Yaorao were standing not far away. They were silently looking at Sharmila, who was sitting alone on the ground. Their eyes were filled with heartache and pity. This is indeed a blow to her. Chen Chongqing sighed and said, "This reminds me of the time when Boss was facing Dean Ning's death in battle. She was also extremely sad. But fortunately, Boss survived and took revenge for Dean Ning." Having heard what was said, Yaorao was silent for a moment, then said, "But the person who killed Heavenly King Oliver is Zerg. It will be too difficult for Sharmila to take revenge." Now, Chen Chongqing and Yaorao were no longer the illiterate, who had just arrived in the universe and didn't know anything. Now, they already had a deep understanding of the cultivation system, and clearly knew what the supreme existence of crossing calamity realms signified. If Sharmila wanted to take revenge on Guru, it would be no different from striking a stone with an egg. "I'm still a little worried about Boss. Boss is still at the front line of Deus cluster, facing the demon army," Chen Chongqing said very anxiously. "If Zerg's army enters the hinterland of Deus cluster, I'm afraid Boss will be attacked from both front and rear." Having heard what was said, Yaorao took a glance at Chen Chongqing and said, "You can rest assured. Scourges live for thousands of years. Qinchuan is only a few decades old. Nothing will happen to him." Chen Chongqing. Whoosh! A gust of wind blew, and the clear sky suddenly became gloomy. Dark clouds gathered. Seeing this scene, Chen Chongqing looked at Sharmila with some surprise and said, "Lightning tribulation? Sharmila is going to cross tribulation." She is going to advance to unification stage. Yarao took a subtle glance at Sharmilla's back and said in a low voice, "Right now, she must be very sad." Sharmilla, who had been sitting on the ground in a daze all along, slowly raised her tear-stained face. Looking at the tribulation clouds in the sky, she said in a low voice, "Teacher, I will take revenge for you. Definitely." Rumble. 9 consecutive lightning tribulations fell, helping Sharmilla advance to unification stage. She went straight to late unification stage. Io Nebula. A remnant army was hidden on a planet called Naya. They had experienced that tragic battle. Because they were far away from the battlefield, and because they retreated decisively enough, they were lucky enough to escape. But seeing their comrades die under that irresistible force with their own eyes, that feeling made every one of them feel incomparably sad. Men do not cry easily, but only when they are not sad. Thelon was also in this remnant army. When the battle broke out, Heavenly King Oliver deliberately arranged for him to be at the edge of the battlefield. At that time, Heavenly King Oliver just wanted to be safe. But he did not expect that an uncontrollable accident would really occur. Recalling Heavenly King Oliver's voice and smile, Thelon's heart was filled with pain. If it were not for the unexpected factor of Guru, with Heavenly King Oliver's strength, it was absolutely impossible for him to fall. With Heavenly King Oliver, they could have easily resisted the attack of Zerg's army. But it was too late to say this now. Go back, let's go back to Stansos, regroup, and kill our way back. From the beginning to the end, Thelon had never given up the idea of fighting for Heavenly King Oliver. He would definitely kill his way back. No matter who the opponent was, no matter how strong they were, he would use all means to kill Guru. Chapter 1247. When the news of Heavenly King Oliver's death and the 200 million Tian people's army almost annihilated reached the front line of the Deus cluster, Vio almost went crazy. Zerg actually hid a supreme existence at the tribulation stage. This news was absolutely a bolt from the blue for them. When Vio wanted to contact Pope Baudolo because of this, he found that Baudolo had lost contact, and the person he contacted was Jialu. The Pope is doing something very important and can't be disturbed by anyone. We need to make our own decisions during this period of time. Hearing Jiali's words, Vio was shocked. He quickly asked, "What is the Pope doing?" Jialu was silent for a moment before replying. The Divine Master summoned the Pope. The Divine Master wants to help the Pope advance to the tribulation stage. Hearing this, Viao's face immediately revealed a pleasantly surprised expression. This news was definitely good news for them. Before you succeed, don't reveal this news to anyone. I'm telling you this mainly to calm you down. Jialu said to Vio, "I'm worried that if the news leaks out, it will speed up the operation of Zerg and the demons. This is very disadvantageous for us. What we lack most now is time." "I know what to do." Vio's tone was very serious. "I will do my best to guard the front line and buy enough time for the Pope to advance." Vio had just finished his conversation with Jialu when Qinchuan came to visit. Vio looked at Qinchuan's cold expression and thought of the good news he had just heard. He hesitated for a moment and didn't share it with Qinchuan in the end. Qinchuan didn't notice the change in Vio's expression. He asked Vio directly, "Is the Divine Master the only one in the tribulation stage in the One God religion?" Vio was shocked when he heard Qinchuan's question. Could it be that Qinchuan had heard some news? However, judging from Qinchuan's behavior, it shouldn't be the case. It seemed that Qinchuan was only asking this out of curiosity. "Qinchuan, are you asking me this because of Guru?" Vio looked at Qinchuan and sighed. To be honest, the news of Guru advancing to the tribulation stage is also very shocking to me. We didn't receive any news before this. Qinchuan frowned slightly and asked, "Is it very difficult to advance from the unification stage to the tribulation stage?" Vio said with a bitter expression, "If it was a simple matter, we wouldn't have waited so many years in the unification stage. If a cultivator wanted to advance from the form synthesis stage to the crossing calamity stage, the most important thing was to cross the calamity. When a cultivator completely fused his strength into one during the form synthesis stage, he had the possibility of triggering the immortal tribulation. Once he crossed the immortal tribulation, he could become an immortal on the spot and would no longer suffer from the thunder tribulation. The so-called immortal was another name for the more powerful cultivators. It was different from the previous cultivators because the cultivators who passed the immortal tribulation and reached the tribulation passing stage would completely transcend the mortal world and become an immortal existence. Only people of the same level could kill a tribulation stage cultivator who could be called an immortal. No matter how strong an overlord at the peak of the unification stage was, it was impossible for him to kill an immortal. Qin Chuan could face a unification stage overlord when he was at the Dongshu stage. However, he couldn't kill a tribulation stage cultivator at the peak of the unification stage. This was the law of the universe and couldn't be broken easily. It was also because of this that tribulation stage cultivators were called supreme existences. Qin Chuan didn't know much about the tribulation stage. After hearing Vio's explanation, he frowned and asked, "So, you're all afraid of the tribulation stage?" Vio nodded, then shook his head and said, "We've been at the peak of the unification stage for countless years. According to common sense, we should have had the chance to reach the peak of the unification stage. However, once we reach the peak of the unification stage, we can't use our strength as we wish in battle because we might trigger the tribulation stage if we're not careful. The tribulation stage is so terrifying that ordinary people can't resist it. Even the rare 9 levels of mysterious heaven tribulation can't compare to a tenth of the tribulation stage." Qin Chuan nodded and said, "So, the Pope should be at the peak of the unification stage." Vio looked at Qin Chuan and said, "What are you trying to say? Now that the situation has taken a turn for the worse and the Deus cluster is about to be destroyed, hasn't the Pope thought of trying to pass the tribulation stage?" Qin Chuan looked at Vio and said, "Or, the Pope has already reached the tribulation stage but hasn't announced it to the public." Vio shook his head and said, "The Pope is indeed at the peak of the unification stage, but he hasn't reached the tribulation stage yet." Qin Chuan heard the hidden meaning in Vio's words. Hasn't reached the tribulation stage yet? Does that mean he's trying to reach the tribulation stage? Seeing the change in Qin Chuan's expression, Vio looked at Qin Chuan suggestively and didn't say anything more. However, Qin Chuan already understood Vio's meaning. In fact, Vio didn't intend to reveal the news that the Pope was trying to pass the tribulation stage to Qin Chuan. However, if he wanted to stabilize the front line and buy enough time for the internal turmoil, he needed Qin Chuan's help. Therefore, in order to stabilize Qin Chuan, he had no choice but to reveal this news to him in a subtle way. This way, he wouldn't break his promise to Qin Chuan. Qin Chuan took a deep breath and said, "Even so, we're still at a disadvantage." "I know, but now we can only take one step at a time." Vio said to Qin Chuan, "We can't afford to lose the front line." Qin Chuan looked at Vio subtly and said, "I feel like I've been tricked by you." Vio shook his head and said, "I'm telling the truth. Besides, we're allies." "All right." Qin Chuan sighed and said, "I'll try my best to buy time for you. However, if the situation develops to a point where it's hard to maintain, I'll leave decisively." Qin Chuan would never fight to the death in the front line. When he had done his best, he would leave decisively. He would never put himself in danger. Even if he had to die, he should die protecting the city of starting points and the war between the human tribe and the demon tribe, not in the war protecting the one God religion. He had never been a selfless person, and it was difficult for him to be selfless. Vio wasn't surprised or angry at Qin Chuan's attitude. They were allies, but he had no reason to ask Qinchuan to sacrifice himself for the Deus cluster and the one God religion. Therefore, he was very grateful that Qinchuan could do his best. While the two were talking, an officer of the one God religion hurried in and said in a hurried tone, "Archbishop, the Devil tribe is on the move. They're gathering their troops." Chapter 1248. Hearing the news brought by the officer, Qinchuan and Vio immediately inquired about the details. The demon army has fully assembled. There are at least 1 billion soldiers stationed at the border. They may launch an attack at any time. Hearing this, Vio's expression changed greatly. He immediately gave the order to defend the 5 lines of defense to the death. At the same time, he dispatched 50 million mobile troops to reinforce the 5 lines of defense. But even so, it was still a drop in the bucket compared to the 1 billion demon army. After Vio gave a series of orders, he let out a long sigh and said, "I can only do my best." As the saying goes, even the cleverest housewife can't cook without rice. Vio's army was only 600 million. Facing the 1 billion demon army in the first wave, the pressure was naturally great. Not to mention, the demon army still had more than 1 billion soldiers to throw into the battlefield. For Vio, this was a hellish challenge. It was also at this moment that Vio finally used the space defense base. He hoped that he could use it to resist the demon army for a long time. The so-called space defense base was a huge war fortress. Its appearance was like an altar. It could hold more than 30 million soldiers at the same time. If the defense ability was fully activated, it could resist the attack of 200 million enemy soldiers. This was Vio's last hope. If even the space defense base couldn't resist the demon army, then he had no other choice. Qinchuan had heard about the space defense base, but this was the first time he saw it with his own eyes. When he saw the huge altar that was like a planet slowly moving forward in the universe, Qinchuan was flabbergasted and said, "This thing can only hold 30 million soldiers?" Vio nodded and said, 70% of the space in the space defense base is occupied by weapons and energy. Therefore, only 30 million people can enter it. If you didn't come in time and stop the demon army's attack, I might have taken it out long ago. Qinchuan looked at the space defense base that was moving forward and said to Vio, "Only one?" Vio nodded and said, "Only one at the front line. The other 2 are in the hinterland of the star cluster. They are the key to resisting Zerg's invasion." Qinchuan heard this and asked curiously, "How is the defense ability of this thing? Can it resist the supreme existence of the tribulation stage?" Wei Ao shot a glance at Qinchuan and said, "If the demons dispatch a supreme existence of the Dujia stage, then we should prepare to flee for our lives." Although the space defense base had super strong defensive power, in the face of the supreme existence of the crossing calamity stage, although it was not as fragile as paper, it was almost there. It was meaningless. Hopefully, the demons won't be so crazy. Qinchuan took a deep breath. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly heard the sound of cannon fire in the distance. The demon race's attack had begun. At the front line, on the main ship of the demon race, Xiada frowned as he looked at the huge altar that was slowly moving towards the front line. He asked, "What is that?" The adjutant replied, "That's the One God Sect's space defense base. It's their trump card." Xiada nodded in understanding and said, "So this is the sky defense base. It looks like a huge tortoise shell. Do you have the confidence to break it?" The adjutant hesitated for a moment and said, "To break through this space defense base, we will need at least 300 million soldiers, and we will have to sacrifice a lot." Xiada glanced at the adjutant and said, "In that case, let's bypass this tortoise shell for the time being and attack in other directions. We will deal with this tortoise shell at the end." Xiada had already sent the 1 billion soldiers of the demon race's vanguard to the 5 battle lines to launch a strong attack at all costs. He wanted to break through the One God sect's defense line in the shortest time possible, then drive straight in and join Zerg's troops to take the Deus cluster together. As for the space defense base, Siada only asked the adjutant to lead the 30 million logistics troops to feign an attack. They would delay it for as long as possible. It would be good if they could break through the space defense base, but it did not matter if they could not. The 5 outer lines of defense belonging to the Deus cluster had been defeated by the demon race's relentless attack. All the troops had been withdrawn to the planets behind them. The demon race's troops had already landed and were ready to engage in a land war with the One God sect. In the universe, only cultivators above the apotheosis stage could freely participate in the war. Although the war was fierce, it was still within an acceptable range. In the land war on the planets, low-level cultivators such as the Gold Core stage and the Nascent Soul stage could participate in the war. Therefore, the bloodbath was even more intense. When the 1 billion soldiers of the demon race rushed to the 5 logistics planets, the intensity of the war escalated sharply. "Kill!" A Gold Core stage cultivator of the demon race roared and waved the long saber in his hand. He had just rushed out of the spaceship and was killed before he could land. He turned into a mass of flesh and blood and splashed in all directions. However, the surrounding demon race soldiers did not even look at him. Even if the blood splashed on their faces, they would not blink because this kind of thing was too common. They had long been used to it. On the other side, every soldier of the One God sect was filled with righteous indignation. They stared at the demon race soldiers who were charging toward them with hatred. They roared and rushed into the battlefield to fight with the demon race soldiers. Countless figures of armored cultivators shuttled back and forth on the battlefield. Every time they attacked, they would definitely take the life of an enemy soldier. They were extremely ruthless. Amidst the roar of the artillery fire, there were people dying under the artillery fire at every moment. Some people died under the enemy's artillery fire, while others were affected by their own artillery fire. The war had developed to such a degree that it was completely chaotic. At this time, Lu Zi and Zhou Lin were fighting the demon race on the logistics planet belonging to Line 3. The two of them had now cooperated seamlessly and caused great interference to the demon race's attack. However, the demon race had too many troops. Even though they had tried their best to kill the enemy, they still could not stop the advance of the demon race. At this time, even Vio, the commander-in-chief of the front line, had joined the war and killed hundreds of demon race officers in succession. However, even without the command of their officers, the demon race soldiers were still in high spirits. They were not afraid of death and were as ruthless as war machines. At this moment, everyone was paying attention to the changes in the situation on the battlefield. However, there was one person who was not in the mood to pay attention to this. His target was always the main ship of the demon race. It was almost impossible for the One God sect to resist and repel the demon race as much as possible unless they had a military strength far exceeding that of the demon race. Now, Qin Chuan thought of a way that was not really a way. To catch bandits, first catch the ringleader. Killing Siada might have a miraculous effect. Chapter 1249. At this time, Qin Chuan was hiding in the space defense base. He looked no different from an ordinary soldier of the One God sect. He was manipulating the weapons in front of him to shoot at the enemies in the distance. When the enemies rushed close to him under the rain of bullets, he would engage in hand-to-hand combat with the enemies, repelling or even annihilating them. Although the demon soldiers were strong, the combat effectiveness of the logistics troops was not as good. They were no match for the 30 million elites of the One God sect in the space defense base. However, because the command center did not require them to fight, the logistics troops did not attack very firmly and aggressively. When they encountered resistance, they would give up after a symbolic attack, as if it was child's play. Compared with the fierce wars on the other 5 logistics planets of the One God sect, The war on the space defense base was indeed too easy and simple. Soon as the commander of the space defense base, High Priest Sulu, discovered this situation. They originally hoped that the powerful defense of the space defense base could delay the demon troops as much as possible. However, the demon troops were using the logistics troops, which had the weakest combat effectiveness, to deal with them perfunctorily. This was the opposite of their plan. No, we must find a way to attract the attention of the demon troops. Sulu clenched his teeth and made a bold decision. He wanted to approach the demon main ship and force the demon troops to dispatch more troops to stop them. It had to be said that Sulu's decision was correct. When the space defense base slowly moved in the direction of the demon main ship, the demon troops immediately responded. The main ship, which acted as the command center, slowly retreated, while the personal guard fleet moved forward to meet the space defense base, preventing it from moving forward. Faced with the attack of 20 million soldiers and 2,000 battleships, the most elite personal guard fleet of the demon troops, the space defense base finally felt a trace of pressure. However, this was completely different from what Sulu had expected. His original intention was that the demon troops could withdraw troops from the frontline battlefield to defend themselves, instead of sending new troops to join the war. However, there was one person who was very satisfied with this situation and even felt a little surprised. This person was Qinchuan. Previously, Qinchuan had been observing the situation of the demon main ship. At that time, the demon main ship was under the protection of many personal guard fleets, so it was very difficult for him to charge in alone. Even he did not dare to bear the bombardment of artillery fire. However, it was different now. The demon main ship took the initiative to leave the protection of the personal guard fleet, and the personal guard fleet was fighting with the space defense base at this time, so they had no time to take care of the main ship. This was a great opportunity for Qinchuan. Thinking of this, Qinchuan no longer delayed and immediately took action. He left the control panel, crossed thousands of miles with the space travel skill, and appeared on the right side of the battlefield. He kept a straight line distance from the demon main ship and used the space travel skill consecutively to shorten the distance between him and the demon main ship in an instant. Just as Qinchuan rapidly approached the demon main ship with the space travel skill, the demon main ship also discovered Qinchuan's trace at the same time. At this time, Qinchuan's aura was restrained and he was wearing the standard combat uniform of the One God sect, so he was not recognized by the demon main ship. However, the space travel skill had already made the demon main ship realize that he was at least an overlord-level expert. General, an unknown person is rapidly approaching the main ship. He is expected to arrive in 2 minutes. In the command center, after detecting Qinchuan's whereabouts, the staff immediately reported the situation to Xiada and presented the image of Qinchuan moving forward to Xiada. After seeing this scene, Xiada faintly said to the 2 guards beside him, "You 2 go and stop him." Yes. The 2 guards standing beside Xiada, whose strength had reached the late stage of the combination realm, answered loudly. They turned around and left the command center, ready to go and stop Qinchuan. When the 2 guards left the main ship and flew toward Qinchuan, who was not far away, Qinchuan also noticed their movements and knew that he had been exposed. However, he was not in a hurry, as if nothing had happened. When the 2 guards were less than 100 miles away from Qinchuan and were about to launch an attack to stop Qinchuan, Qinchuan's space travel skill suddenly crossed thousands of miles and directly appeared above the command center of the demon main ship. The reason why Qinchuan only traveled 1,000 miles each time before was just to deliberately confuse the enemy. With Qinchuan's current attainments in the law of space, he could see anywhere in the blink of an eye. The moment Qinchuan disappeared in front of them, the command center of the demon main ship immediately activated the emergency plan and began to search for Qinchuan. At the same time, A powerful sword light pierced through the defense array of the demon main ship and stabbed into the command center of the demon main ship. Clang! With a crisp and violent collision sound, Xiada slowly stood up. He looked up at the sword light that he had blocked with his iron fist and couldn't help but reveal a cold look on his face. "You want to kill me? How naive. Is that so?" Extremely abruptly, a cold voice sounded behind Xiada. Xiada activated the defensive mechanism of his battle armor almost without hesitation. However, all of this was useless against Qin Chuan. Qin Chuan let out a low roar and waved his hands. With Xiada's waist as the center, a disc-shaped spatial crack suddenly appeared and silently cut Xiada's waist in half. "This is impossible." Xiada's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Qin Chuan sneered. Nothing was impossible in this universe. At such a close distance, Xiada had no chance to dodge his space slash. Moreover, if Qin Chuan did not have the confidence to kill Xiada in one blow, he would not have formulated the decapitation plan. After the space slash completely obliterated Xiada's vitality, Qin Chuan raised his hand and punched out, directly blowing up the demon main ship. At the same time, he returned to the battlefield using the space travel technique. The demon commander Xiada is dead. The command center of the demon main ship has been destroyed. When Qin Chuan's loud shout resounded throughout the battlefield, all the demon soldiers were shocked and subconsciously turned their heads to look at the main ship in the distance. However, all they could see was the wreckage that was still exploding. The main ship had exploded. The command center was gone. The commander was also gone. When these thoughts appeared in the minds of the Devil Race soldiers, their minds were inevitably affected, and their combat effectiveness declined. On the other hand, the soldiers of the One God sect became braver as the battle progressed. Everyone was shouting and cheering excitedly. When the news of the demon commander's decapitation spread to the other 5 logistics planets that were engaged in a chaotic battle, the morale of the soldiers of the One God sect and the Tian people soared, while the morale of the demon soldiers who could not contact the command center was low. The defeat of the demon race was inevitable. Chapter 1250. When Jiao Lu was eager to compete with the Zergs, the demon vanguard was resting and reorganizing on the Devil Star. Originally, Vio wanted to have all the troops adjust their state as soon as possible. However, Qin Chuan put forward a very bold suggestion at this moment. Raid the Devil Star. When he heard this suggestion, Vio thought that Qin Chuan was crazy. They had less than 400 million soldiers and most of them were exhausted. Raiding the Devil Star at this time was no different than delivering food to them. However, Qin Chuan's next words made Vio heave a long sigh of relief. "Don't get too excited. I don't intend to ask you to mobilize too many soldiers. I only need you to mobilize some fusion overlords for me." Qin Chuan's original intention was to gather some elites and raid the Devil Star. They would create chaos for the demon troops with their high mobility and great destructive power. The key was not how many people they could kill, but the key was to break the morale of the demon troops. After hearing Qin Chuan's words, Vio began to consider the feasibility of this matter. Although Vio was very confident in Qin Chuan, it would be too unbearable for them to lose the fighting strength of fusion overlords. Qin Chuan was clear about Vio's concerns. He directly said to Vio, "Don't worry, I'll bring back as many people as I bring out." After hearing this, Vio took a deep look at Qin Chuan and said, "Okay, since that's the case, it's settled. But I have to make one thing clear. This matter is completely voluntary. If someone doesn't want to participate, I can't force them." Qin Chuan smiled and said, "Let's do as you say." After Vio revealed Qin Chuan's idea to the fusion overlords in the front line, to Vio's surprise, no one refused. Everyone was willing to follow Qin Chuan to raid the Devil Star. Since Qin Chuan came to the front line, the fusion overlords who had been suppressed by the demon troops finally felt elated. They had won 3 consecutive battles, which not only boosted their morale, but also gave them a glimmer of hope of blocking the demon troops outside the dais cluster. Now, Qin Chuan wanted to lead them to the Devil Star where they had never been before and attack the demon troop. How could they let go of such an opportunity? Therefore, in just a short while, Vio received no less than 100 applications. When Vio told this to Qin Chuan directly said that the first 100 applicants would be enough. An hour later, 100 fusion overlords from various front lines arrived in front of Qin Chuan. Qin Chuan had seen some of them before, and some of them were new to him. However, all of them recognized Qin Chuan and even addressed Qin Chuan as General. General Qin, you want to lead us to raid the Devil Star? Are you planning to kill all the officers of the demon troops? General, just tell us what to do. We'll listen to you. Why don't we just blow up the Devil Star? Qin Chuan didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard the clamor of the crowd. Blow up the Devil Star? The Devil Star still looked like a planet, but in fact, it had been transformed into a military base. The interior of the planet was completely made of solid alloy. Unless a supreme existence of the tribulation stage took action, it would be impossible to blow up the Devil Star. Moreover, when did he become a general? Everyone, don't get too excited. Let's set off first. We'll talk about it on the way. For this attack, Qin Chuan didn't borrow a spaceship from Vio. Instead, he planned to lead everyone forward using the space traversal technique. He wanted to get close to the Devil Star without being discovered. When everyone set off, they finally knew what Qin Chuan's battle plan was. Qin Chuan didn't want to blow up the Devil Star, but he wanted to blow up the logistics base of the demon troops. Qin Chuan wanted the battleships of the demon troops to have no energy to use, no bullets to use guns, no armor to wear, and no weapons to use. Although Qin Chuan's battle plan didn't sound very pleasant, there was no doubt that it was very significant. Once they destroyed the logistics base of the demon troops, they would definitely weaken the fighting strength of the demon troops to the greatest extent. In this way, it would be equivalent to increasing the fighting strength of the demon troop. They would definitely gain a certain degree of advantage in the next battle. Of course, if the demon troops chose to avoid the battle due to the loss of various materials, they would be very willing to see such a situation. Their goal had always been to defend the front line. The longer they could delay, the better. It would be best if they could stay in a stalemate forever. From the logistics planet number 3 to the Devil Star, Qin Chuan used the space traversal technique 6 times. After an hour, they finally arrived at the periphery of the Devil Star. To their surprise, the periphery of the Devil Star was undefended. Seeing this scene, Qin Chuan's heart slightly moved. He said, "It seems that after losing their commander and command center, these demons have no discipline. They don't even carry out the most basic defense." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Lu Zi replied, "Maybe they didn't even think that we would attack them. In their opinion, we should be glad that we're not attacked by them." A high priest of the one God religion immediately said to Qin Chuan, "As far as I know, the demon troops have always been guarding the periphery of the Devil Star tightly. Maybe because Xiada died and the command center was gone, those commanders slacked off. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made such a huge mistake." "That's good." Qin Chuan smiled and said to the others, "It's too conspicuous for 100 of us to act together. Next, I'll act alone to spy for information. After that, I'll come back to discuss the battle plan with you." Everyone naturally had no objections to Qin Chuan's arrangement. Qin Chuan had the space traversal technique, so he could come and go without a trace. He was most suitable for spying. After telling everyone to be careful, Qin Chuan flew directly to the Devil Star. When he approached the atmosphere of the Devil Star, Qin Chuan finally saw the guards of the demon race. These guards were patrolling everywhere, looking very vigilant. Qin Chuan carefully bypassed the patrolling troops and entered the interior of the Devil Star. At this time, the interior of the Devil Star was very quiet, and there were very few traces of people. It seemed that except for the reverent troop, basically everyone was recuperating and adjusting. This created a very good opportunity for Qinchuan. The location of the logistics base was very easy to identify. The huge base in the center of all the barracks should be the logistics base of the demon race. Qinchuan approached the logistics base in a flash and found many guards around the logistics base. He did not approach rashly, but turned around and left, preparing to bring people over. Chapter 1252. At this moment, the commanders of the 5 demon armies were gathered in the conference room. They were discussing what they should do before Prince Fro arrived at the front line. Let's not talk about anything else. Let's first decide whose army will be responsible for the defense. A demon commander wearing a black iron mask said in a low voice. He proposed to solve the problem of defense first. In the past, Xiada would randomly select a unit to solve the problem of defense. Now that Xiada was gone, no one would randomly select a unit to solve the problem. I propose to follow the old rules and draw lots. A demon commander with a sinister and ugly face said indifferently, "This is the fairest. If you want to draw lots, you can draw lots. My subordinates suffered heavy losses today and need to rest. Moreover, the defense was done by my troops a few days ago. Now it's your turn." A slightly short demon commander was playing with a mechanical ball in his hand as he spoke in a very casual tone and attitude. "Little shorty, what are you talking about?" The demon commander wearing a black iron mask glanced sharply at the short demon commander. His words were full of dissatisfaction. "Iron Mask, do you really think that I, Yak, am afraid of you? In the past, General Xiada was here, so I didn't bicker with you. But now, if you dare to look down on me like this, I will use your blood to wash away the shame." Hearing Yak's words, Iron Mask was furious. Just as he was about to flare up, he was stopped by another demon commander. "Everyone, don't quarrel. If Prince Fro knows about this, I'm afraid you will be in trouble." Tai Mian and Yak finally calmed down after hearing these words. However, it was obvious that they had temporarily swallowed their anger because of Prince Fro's reputation. If there was an opportunity in the future, they would still quarrel and even fight. Talon looked at everyone helplessly and said, "How about this? From today onwards, my troops will be responsible for the defense. But I want the logistics base to replenish the equipment my troops need first." Hearing Talon's words, everyone frowned. Now that there was no commander and command center to distribute the resources, they would be much more casual if they wanted to replenish the resources from the logistics base. But whose needs should be satisfied first was still a problem. Now, Talon wanted to be the first to receive resources from the logistics base on the grounds that she was responsible for guarding the base. It was reasonable, but the others were still a little uncomfortable. Just as everyone was about to say something, an extremely violent roar suddenly sounded from outside. What happened? Talon looked in the direction of the explosion in shock. That direction? It's the logistics base. Iron Face growled. "We've been ambushed." Upon hearing Tai Mian's words, everyone was in disbelief. They had been fighting with the One God sect and the Tian clan for nearly half a year. They had always been the ones attacking the One God sect and the Tian clan. This was the first time they had been ambushed by the One God sect and the Tian clan. Bastard! Yak was furious. He left the conference room in a flash and went straight to the logistics base. Seeing this, the others followed him. At the entrance of the logistics base, 101 overlords in the body integration realm, including Qinchuan, were unscrupulously pouring firepower on the demon's logistics base. Various lights fell on the logistics base, erupting with extremely shocking destructive power. In just a moment, the huge logistics base turned into a sea of fire. Explosions continued, and most of the resources stored inside were destroyed. "It's about time, brothers." Qinchuan looked around and then at his feet. Then, he said to everyone, Now that the demon's attention is on the logistics base, let's destroy the demon's fleet. Hearing Qinchuan's words, everyone stopped attacking in a very disciplined manner. Then, they turned around and followed Qinchuan to the port where the demon's battleships were parked. Soon, the starport of the Devil Star was attacked, and tens of thousands of battleships were destroyed. When several demon commanders rushed to the port in anger, Qinchuan and the others had already retreated. On the way back to Logistics Planet Number 3, everyone's face was filled with carefree smiles. Although they did not confront the demons head-on this time, it was even more satisfying than killing them head-on. It's really too satisfying. I really wanted to stay and see the expressions on the faces of those demon commanders. It must be very exciting. Haha, the demons suffered heavy losses this time. Even if they mobilize resources and fleets from the rear in time, it will take at least 10 days for them to arrive. Why don't we do it again and torture them? Hearing their words, Qinchuan chuckled and said, "It's already very lucky that such a thing can happen once. Don't think about it a second time." For Qinchuan, as long as tonight's action could delay them for more than 10 days, it would be a good thing. As for how to face the angry demons after that, he would think about it later. When Qinchuan and the others returned to Logistics Planet Number 3 with this good news, Vio almost laughed out loud. If Lu Zi had not stopped him, he would have hugged Qinchuan in his arms and kissed him to his heart's content. Since Qinchuan came to the front line, Vio's waist and legs were no longer sore. He could kill 1,000,000 demons in one go. It was really a smooth and refreshing experience. Qinchuan was simply his lucky star. Just as Qinchuan and the others returned victorious, far away in the Aogu Nebula, the 500 million troops mobilized by Jia Lu had arrived at the predetermined battlefield and were waiting for the arrival of Zerg's troops. At this time, Zerg's troops were less than 2 days' journey away from the main forces of the One God sect. However, Zerg's troops were not advancing at full speed. Instead, they were advancing very slowly. On the main ship, Guru looked at the emissary of the Void Empire standing in front of him and asked in a deep voice, "Why didn't Fetatik come?" The emissary of the Void Empire replied, "Sir, the Marshal has led the troops to the Heavenly Void Continent. After breaking through the Heavenly Void Continent and killing the remnants of the previous dynasty, he will naturally come to join you." Guru asked, "So, what news have you brought?" The emissary of the Void Empire immediately replied, "The Marshal hopes that you can annihilate the main forces of the One God sect in the Aogu Nebula within 3 days." "I see." Guru took a deep look at the emissary of the Void Empire and said, "Tell Fetatik on my behalf that in 3 days, I will lead the troops to attack the One God Church directly. I hope that Fetatik can be present when I face the Divine Master." The emissary of the Void Empire replied respectfully, "Yes, sir. I will pass on your words to the Marshal." Chapter 1253. When the news of the attack on the Devil Planet's logistics base and starport reached the Demon Palace, the Demon King was furious. He almost ordered the execution of the 5 commanders. The Devil Planet, which had close to 1 billion soldiers, was actually attacked by 100 people. This was a great humiliation. If it were not for Prince Forio's message that he wanted the 5 commanders to redeem themselves, the Demon King would never have let them go. Under Prince Forio's suggestion, the Demon Palace had already mobilized the nearby resources and sent them to the Devil Planet. However, it would take at least 10 days for this batch of resources to reach the Devil Planet. Furthermore, the Demon King solemnly gave Prince Forio a death order. Once he encountered Qinchuan, he was to immediately kill Qinchuan on the spot. In the past, the demon race had always been suppressing the One God sect and the Tian people on the front line. However, ever since Qinchuan came to the front line, everything had changed. Not only did the demon race lose every battle, but even the demon race suffered a loss at the hands of Qinchuan and became a stepping stone for Qinchuan's fame. This time, Qin Chuan led the attack on the Devil Planet, causing them to lose a lot of resources and delay the battle. He was simply the bane of the demon race. If there was a chance to kill Qin Chuan, the Demon King would definitely do it without hesitation. However, he was not at the front line at this time, so this mission could only be handed over to Prince Foreo. With Prince Foreo's strength, it was naturally easy for him to kill Qin Chuan. The Iron Chain Galaxy was located in the middle of the Augu Nebula. Because the planets in the galaxy were all connected in a straight line, it was named the Iron Chain Galaxy. Jia Li's planned battlefield was here. He wanted to use the 14 planets in the Iron Chain Galaxy to stop Zerg's troops. At this time, the residents of the Deus Cluster in the Iron Chain Galaxy had been evacuated. Most of the One God Sect's 500 million soldiers had already settled in these 14 planets and were waiting for the arrival of Zerg's troop. Archbishop, Zerg's troops have entered the Iron Chain Galaxy. They are only 1,000,000 kilometers away from us. With the speed of Zerg's battleship, it would only take one interstellar jump to reach 1,000,000 kilometers. Jia Lu glanced at the high priest and said, "Pass down the order to make everyone." Rumble. A violent rumble resounded, causing Jia Li's expression to change abruptly. "Archbishop, Zerg is coming. They're coming from behind." At this moment, there was a burst of panicked exclamations in the command center. Behind? How is this possible? Jia Lu could not believe it. How could Zerg come from behind them? Could it be that Zerg still had a fleet hidden in the Deus Cluster? Right now, Gale had no time to think about these problems. He had to make an emergency response, adjust his strategy, and stop Zerg's attack. However, just as Jia Lu was about to give the order, a pale figure suddenly appeared in front of him. Where did that old fellow Saint Bodhidharma go? Hearing this cold voice, Jia Lu looked at the tall figure standing in front of him, and his eyes flashed with uncontrollable fear. When he wanted to speak, he found that he had lost the ability to speak. "Forget it, I'll investigate it myself." As the pale figure's voice was recorded, everyone in the command center, including Jia Lu, died instantly. In 2 days, Zerg's troops swept through all the troops of the One God Church in the Iron Chain Galaxy, killing more than 300 million of them. The rest of the troops were all captured. When this news spread, everyone in the God's star cluster went crazy and was on the verge of collapse. Cardinal Jia Lu, whom they had high hopes for, had been defeated, and Pope Saint Baudelo had disappeared without a trace. The One God religion was suddenly plunged into a dangerous situation without a leader. At the front line, Vio had only been happy for 2 days before he was tormented by this sudden bad news. He could not sleep at night and he was in pain and despair. 500 million troops. Gone just like that. Vio was extremely sad, but he did not blame Jia Lu. No matter who faced Guru, who was already in the crossing calamity stage, they would not be able to escape death. Qin Chuan looked at Vio, who was crying, and sighed. There's no other way. Zerg directly sent Guru to cut off Jia Li's command center. The 500 million troops immediately lost their commander. It's normal for them to be annihilated by Zerg. When Qin Chuan wanted to cut off Xia Da's command center, he had to take advantage of the right time, place, and people, and he also had to take a certain risk. On the other hand, Guru only needed to say a few words to cut off Jia Li's command center. This was the huge difference between the combination stage and the crossing calamity stage. At this time, as long as the Divine Master did not appear and Pope Saint Bodhidharma did not advance to the crossing calamity stage, no one in the Deus cluster could stop the rampant Guru unless the one true God, Atheus, took action. What should we do? Vio was very uncomfortable. Their front line was defended, but the hinterland of the Deus cluster was about to become the backyard of Zerg's troops. What was the point of them defending the front line? Qin Chuan looked at Vio and said, "You want to withdraw your troops and go back to help?" Vio nodded and said, "The only continent is the core of the Deus cluster. If Zerg breaks through it, everything will be over. The only continent was located in the Omo Nebula in the center of the Deus cluster. The Omo Nebula and the recently fallen Ogu Nebula were only separated by the Tuluan Nebula. With the advancing speed of Zerg's troops, it would take less than a month to break through the almost defenseless Omo Nebula and then capture the only continent. The troops in Vio's hands could be said to be the last of the one-god religion's asset. If he could not use the troops in his hands to defend the only continent, everything would be over. Qinchuan frowned slightly and said, "Do you think it's useful for you to go back? Can you stop Guru?" Vio fell silent. If he were to face Guru, his ending would definitely not be better than Gale's. Qinchuan said seriously to Vio, "Now, if the Master of God and Saint Bador don't come out, it's meaningless for any of us to go back. The most important thing for us now is to continue to defend the front line. If things don't work out, I suggest that we all withdraw into the Celestial Cluster and reorganize a line of defense in the Celestial Cluster to continue resisting the invasion of the Nephilim race and Zerg." Vio's eyes widened when he heard Qinchuan's words. He said, "You want to abandon the entire Deus Cluster?" Qinchuan took a deep look at Vio and asked, "Do you think we can still defend the Deus Cluster by relying on the few of us?" Vio fell silent again. Just as Qinchuan said, if the Master of God and Pope Saint Bador don't come out, they would not be able to defend the Deus Cluster against Guru. If we live, we live. If we lose, we lose. Qinchuan pursed his lips and said, "As long as we still have people, we will have a chance to take back everything. Once everyone dies, everything will be over." Chapter 1254. The One God sect had once again lost a red-cloaked archbishop and lost 500 million troops. This had a great impact on all the forces. Everyone was shocked by the strength of the Zerg and lamented the rough fate of the One God sect. However, they could not help but grieve for the loss of their kind. At this time, the 300 million soldiers that the Tian people were preparing to march into the Deus Cluster had no choice but to stop in Io Nebula. They started to organize their defense line and prepare to resist the invasion of Zerg and the Nephilim race. As for the matter of rescuing the Deus Cluster, they had already given up. The various forces were joining the Allied army. The speed at which they mobilized their forces was not slow to begin with. At this time, the One God religion's misfortune was like a whip that struck them hard. They had no choice but to grit their teeth and increase the speed at which they mobilized their forces. In less than 10 days, the various forces quickly gathered a force of more than 1 billion soldiers and rushed to Io Nebula to help the Tian people consolidate their defense line. At this time, in addition to the troops that the Tian people had mobilized from all over the world, the total strength of the Allied army in Io Nebula had exceeded 2 billion soldiers. At this time, the various forces were still trying their best to mobilize their forces to Io Nebula. Obviously, all the forces in the Allied army wanted to have a decisive battle with the Nephilim race and Zerg in Io Nebula. If they won, everyone would be happy. If they lost, they could only wait for death. Just as the various forces were making their moves, Prince Furio of the Nephilim race finally arrived at the Devil Planet. At the same time, the war resources that had already arrived at the Devil Planet had been distributed to the various forces. The arrival of Prince Furio was a good thing for the various Nephilim forces. However, the commanders of the various forces were a little worried at this time. They were afraid that Prince Furio would cause trouble for them because of the destruction of the logistics base. However, to their surprise, Prince Furio did not mention a word about the destruction of the logistics base. When he saw the commanders, he only said one sentence calmly: "Let's move out." These 4 simple words clearly explained Prince Furio's intention. He wanted to attack the border defense line of the God Star Cluster, and now was the time. Although Prince Furio had just arrived at the Devil Planet and had not rested, he did not understand the situation of the various forces on the Devil Planet. He also did not understand the situation of the Deus Cluster's defense line. However, this was not a problem, because Prince Forio was a supreme existence in the tribulation stage. Recalling the death of the chain, so what if Red Archbishop Gale had 500 million soldiers? In front of Guru, who was a supreme existence in the tribulation stage, he was nothing, and if Guru could do it, there was no reason why Prince Forio couldn't. After hearing Prince Forio's defense line, the Nephilim race, the Nephilim race's defense line, the Nephilim race to attack. Prince Forio's arrival on the Devil Star wasn't a secret to the scouts that Vio arranged around the Devil Star. When the scouts sent this information back to Logistics Planet Number 3, Vio groaned in pain. Just the day before yesterday, the arrival of 300 million reinforcements greatly boosted Vio's confidence. He believed that he could resist the demons for a longer period of time with his 700 million troop. However, the arrival of Prince Fro had completely destroyed his confidence. In front of Prince Forio, even if he had an army of 1 billion, it would be useless. When Qin Chuan arrived at the command center, he saw the despairing Vio. When he heard about Prince Forio's situation from Vio, Qin Chuan could not help but feel despair as well. Although he was almost invincible in the Unity stage, he was not enough to face a supreme existence in the Tribulation stage. The will of a demon king had almost killed him with the help of a phantom, let alone a supreme existence in the Crossing Calamity stage, who had come in person. Qin Chuan did not believe that he had the ability to face Prince Forio head-on. Qin Chuan, you should leave. Vio let out a long sigh. He looked at Qin Chuan with a complicated gaze. Qin Chuan's arrival gave him hope of stopping the advance of the Nephilim. In fact, they did stop the advance of the Nephilim. But this time, he was truly in despair. Qin Chuan had done enough. Now, he decided to die for his religion. Qin Chuan was not a member of the One God religion, nor was he a member of the Deus Cluster. There was no reason for him to stay here and die with him. Qin Chuan frowned and looked at Vio. Do you want to die on the battlefield? Vio sighed and said, The Pope ordered me to come to the front lines to supervise the battle. I made a military pledge to fight to the death. Qin Chuan heard this and said, You're too muddle-headed. You're only useful and meaningful if you live. It's not worth dying here. There's not much time left. You don't have to persuade me. Vio shook his head. I've made up my mind. Of course, Vio knew that only by living could one hope to regain everything. But if he left, what would happen to the nearly 700 million soldiers on the front lines? He was a dignified frontline commander, and he could not abandon these soldiers who had shed blood to protect the One God religion and flee alone. Qin Chuan, when you leave, take the remaining Tian people with you. The Tian people have already built a new line of defense in the Io star cloud. They're needed there. Vio could let the soldiers of the One God religion accompany him to die defending the Deus Cluster, but there was no reason for him to let the Tian people die with him. Seeing that Qin Chuan did not take any action, Vio said, Hurry up and leave. It'll be too late. The Nephilim had begun to mobilize their forces. Today, they would definitely launch an attack on the border of the Deus Cluster. If Qin Chuan did not take the opportunity to leave now, it would be difficult to leave in a while. Why do you always give me this kind of difficult problem? Qin Chuan sighed helplessly. Although Vio's words were very reasonable, Qin Chuan would feel uneasy if he really left like this. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Vio shook his head and said, You misunderstood me. What I said was from the bottom of my heart. I'm not trying to make you stay by acting pitiful. When Prince Forio arrives, even 10 of you will be useless. Qin Chuan also shook his head and said, You misunderstood me too. I don't plan to stay. I'm just going to leave with everyone. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Vio immediately looked at Qin Chuan in surprise and said, You have a way to take all of us away? Vio had chosen to stay because he wanted to live and die with the soldiers on the front lines. If everyone could leave the front lines safely, then Vio had no reason to die here. Qin Chuan nodded with a slightly dignified expression and said, I can try my best. Chapter 1255. Vio knew that time was of the essence, so he didn't hesitate and immediately gave the order for all the troops on the 5 logistics planets to gather on the 3rd logistics planet. They didn't want to leave behind anything that could be brought along. When Vio gave the order, everyone guessed that Vio was ready to give up on the front line. Yes, Prince Fro was already here. If they didn't give up on the front line, it would be equivalent to giving up on the hope of survival. However, no one knew that Vio had already given up on the hope of survival. But because of Qin Chuan's words, he decided to give it a try. Logistics Planet Number 3. Vio looked at Qin Chuan, who was inscribing runes on the ground with an extremely ashamed expression. Ever since Qin Chuan arrived, not only did he not help Qin Chuan, but he had also been receiving help from Qin Chuan. He really felt that he had let Qin Chuan down. At this moment, Qin Chuan didn't have the time to pay attention to Vio because he had to put all his energy into inscribing runes. This was an extremely large teleportation rune array. Even with his perfect core condensation realm mental strength, it was still a bit difficult to inscribe it. Lu Zi, who heard the news, saw that only a small portion of the rune array was inscribed on the ground. She was shocked and said, "This is an interstellar teleportation rune array?" Lu Zi was very familiar with the interstellar teleportation rune array. This was because the teleportation rune array that connected Stansos and the various nebulas of the celestial cluster was the same one. She had used the interstellar teleportation rune array many times before, so she definitely wouldn't be mistaken. However, no matter which nebula it was, the interstellar teleportation rune array was an extremely large project. It wasn't something that could be done by one person in a day. And now, Qin Chuan wanted to inscribe the interstellar teleportation rune array in a day. This was simply hell-level difficulty. Lu Zi wanted to help Qin Chuan, but she didn't know how to do it. Although she had seen the interstellar teleportation rune array before, it was considered a rare spatial teleportation rune array. With her attainments in the law of space, it was very difficult for her to help Qin Chuan. If she forcefully helped, it would only add to the chaos. Zhou Lin looked at the rune array on the ground and said to Lu Zi, "With Qin Chuan's attainments in the law of space and his experience with rune arrays, it's not impossible to inscribe the interstellar teleportation rune array by himself. But it's going to take time." Yes, it's going to take time. In Zhou Lin's opinion, if Qin Chuan was given a month, with Qin Chuan's ability, he would definitely be able to inscribe the interstellar teleportation rune array. However, Qin Chuan had less than a day. It was too difficult for him to inscribe the interstellar teleportation rune array. At this time, Vio already knew Qin Chuan's intentions. He was amazed by Qin Chuan's unconstrained ideas, but he didn't have any expectations for Qin Chuan. He wanted to persuade Qin Chuan to put down the rune pen and leave quickly, but when he saw the determined expression on Qin Chuan's face, he couldn't bring himself to say those words. "I'll go buy some time for Qin Chuan." As she spoke, Zhou Lin turned and flew into the distance. Lu Zi quickly followed. "Where are you going?" "I'll go with you." Zhou Lin looked at the determined expression on Lu Zi's face and said, "I don't know if Qin Chuan can really inscribe the interstellar teleportation rune array in a day or how to connect it to other rune arrays. There's not much I can do. I can only buy more time for him." If she wanted to buy time for Qin Chuan, she had to delay the advance of the demon race. Lu Zi heard this and asked, "What do you want to do?" Zhou Lin looked deeply at Lu Zi and said, "Borrow a few planets." The Deus Cluster's gathering of troops on Logistics Planet 3 didn't go unnoticed by the demon race. The demon race wasn't surprised by this. If it were them, if they knew that the Divine Master was coming, they would also choose to gather their troops and retreat. Only a fool would stay and fight head-on. Therefore, in order to prevent the One God sect and the Tion people from running too far away, the demon race gathered faster. After 2 hours, all 900 million troops were gathered. They drove tens of thousands of battleships and rushed toward the border of the Deus cluster. When the 900 million troops of the demon race arrived at the border of the Deus cluster, they were stunned when they saw the 4 planets in front of them. "What's this?" Yak was a little surprised. "We haven't entered the Deus cluster yet. Why did the 4 logistics planets of the Deus cluster suddenly appear here? And they're so neat and tidy." Yak was puzzled, and so were the other demon race commanders. Could it be that the One God sect had set up an ambush on these 4 planets? Prince Fro, who didn't know much about the situation at the front line, saw this and asked Taran, who was standing beside him, "What's going on?" Taran immediately said to Prince Fro, "Prince, these 4 planets are the logistics planets of the One God sect. They should be located within the border of the Deus cluster as the last line of defense for the One God sect. But now they've appeared on the border. This is very strange." Taran knew that the One God sect had already modified these 4 logistics planets. These 4 logistics planets could be moved, but why did the One God sect move them here? Could it be that they wanted to blow up these 4 planets to block their way? But they had Prince Fro, so this method was useless. After hearing Taran's explanation, Prince Fro said to Taran, "Inform everyone to stay put and wait for my return." Before he finished speaking, Prince Fro's figure had already disappeared from the command center of the main ship and appeared in front of Logistics Planet 2. He raised his hand and waved gently. All the buildings on the surface of Logistics Planet 2 turned into ashes and dissipated. A huge golden ball appeared in front of him. "What's this?" Prince Fro frowned slightly. "A golden ball?" After Prince Fro attacked the other 3 planets, 4 golden balls appeared in front of him. This scene not only made Prince Fro confused, but also the demon army behind him was stunned. What was the One God sect doing? Bang! Prince Forio swung his fist and punched the golden ball. The golden ball instantly exploded, and countless purple rays of light shot out from the golden fragments that filled the sky. These purple rays shone on Prince Fro but didn't affect him at all. But to the other demons they had an illusory effect. Kill the One God sect. When the demon soldiers in a fleet began to roar and kill each other, Prince Fro finally realized the effect of the purple rays in the golden balls. When the exploded golden ball turned into countless sharp swords and shot towards Prince Fro's face immediately turned gloomy. He hated these boring and useless tricks. Chapter 1256. To others, perhaps the golden sphere's sword rain and the illusionary colored radiance were very threatening. However, to Prince Forio, these methods were only insignificant and could not be put on the table. Scram! Prince Forio roared. The 3 intact golden balls immediately exploded. However, this time, whether it was the purple radiance or the golden sword rain, they weren't able to erupt. Instead, Prince Forio strangled them in the cradle. In the distance, when Lu Zi and Zhou Lin saw this scene, their expressions became incomparably unsightly. They borrowed these 4 logistics planets from Vio. Originally, they wanted to use them to ambush the demonic army and cause some interference to the demonic army. However, when Prince Forio made his move, all their meticulous preparations were broken. Is this the strength of a transcending tribulation stage expert? Lu Zi said in shock. He made our methods ineffective without any effort. Zhou Lin said in a deep voice, "We've only delayed them for a few minutes. It's basically equivalent to not doing anything." In their plan, they would delay the demonic army for at least half a day. However, it seemed that they had underestimated Prince Forio and overestimated themselves. Not to mention half a day, even half an hour would be difficult. continue to think of a way. At this time, they couldn't retreat. They had to brace themselves and continue attacking. At this time, Lu Zi and Zhou Lin suddenly felt like they were being watched. They subconsciously looked at Prince Foryo in the distance. Facing Prince Foryo's cold and sharp eyes, Lu Zi and Zhou Lin turned pale with fright. They've been discovered. When this thought appeared in their minds, Lu Zi and Zhou Lin unhesitatingly turned around and fled. Since they've been discovered by Prince Foryo, if they continued to stay here, it would be equivalent to waiting for death. Boom! An incomparably powerful aura rushed towards Lu Zi and Zhou Lin. Even though Lu Zi and Zhou Lin tried their best, they still couldn't escape from Prince Foryo's pursuit. In just a moment, Prince Foryo was already 10,000 kilometers behind them. Prince Foryo looked at Lu Zi and Zhou Lin in front of him, as if he was looking at two ants. He raised his hand and lightly pinched Lu Zi and Zhou Lin, causing their escaping speed to instantly decrease. They practically stopped in place. When their bodies stopped uncontrollably, Lu Zi and Zhou Lin couldn't help but reveal a trace of fear. In the next moment, Prince Foryo appeared in front of the two and sized them up with a crying expression. "I know you too." Contrary to Lu Zi and Zhou Lin's expectations, Prince Foryo, "You two are Qinchuan's companions." Prince Fro looked at LVZ and Zhou Lin, and the expression on his face gradually became subtle. "What do you want to do?" Lu Zi looked at Prince Foryo with vigilance. If Prince Foryo intended to use them to threaten Qinchuan, then she would choose to die immediately. Prince Foryo glanced at Lu Zi and said, "I don't plan to do anything. I'm only going to kill you." With that, Prince Foryo slowly raised his hand towards Lu Zi and wanted to crush Lu Zi. At this moment, a violent rumble of thunder suddenly sounded behind him. A thick pillar of lightning descended from the sky and directly struck him. Rumble! Prince Foryo, who hadn't experienced the pain of tribulation lightning for over 1,000 years, once again tasted the taste of tribulation lightning. Moreover, it wasn't very pleasant. LVZ and Zhou Lin immediately broke free from Furo's control after Prince Furo was struck by the lightning tribulation. They instantly pulled apart the distance between them and Prince Furo. When they arrived at a safe location, they subconsciously looked at the man with the tribulation cloud above his head and lightning tribulation. When Lu Zi and Zhou Lin noticed Qinchuan, Prince Foryo also slowly turned around and looked at Qinchuan, who was over 1,000 miles away. Prince Foryo looked at the tribulation clouds above Qinchuan's head and his expression couldn't help but become gloomy. He hadn't been struck by tribulation lightning for over 1,000 years. He didn't think that Qinchuan would let him taste it again. You can control tribulation lightning because you control the law of lightning? Prince Foryo only pondered for a moment and saw through Qinchuan's methods. If Qinchuan didn't suddenly launch a sneak attack, he might not have been hit. Compared to other things, he was more curious about how Qinchuan appeared within 1,000 miles of him without being discovered. Rumble! The second tribulation lightning struck Qinchuan. Qinchuan used the law of lightning to dissolve the destructive power of the tribulation lightning and absorb the power to strengthen himself. His gaze was fixed on Prince Foryo. As long as Prince Foryo made any strange movements, he wouldn't hesitate to control the tribulation lightning to attack Prince Foryo. Qinchuan naturally knew that the lightning tribulation caused by a mere minor tribulation wouldn't be able to cause any harm to Prince Foryo. However, as long as he could prevent Prince Foryo from taking any further action against LVZ and Zhou Lin, that would be enough. You two leave. Qinchuan had to stay behind to restrain Prince Foryo. If Lu Zi and Zhou Lin stayed behind, they would only distract him. When Lu Zi and Zhou Lin heard Qinchuan's words, they revealed expressions of shame. They had once again become a burden to Qinchuan. They had become a burden to Qinchuan. However, now wasn't the time to be willful. If they didn't leave, Qinchuan would be in more danger. Whoosh! Lu Zi and Zhou Lin fled. Prince Foryo didn't have any intention of stopping them. Lu Zi and Zhou Lin were merely ants to him. If he encountered them, he could crush them to death at any time. He still remembered the mission given to him by the Demon King. Qin Chuan must die. Rumble. When the third tribulation lightning struck, Qin Chuan calmly dissolved it. At this moment, his aura had already broken through the middle stage of the body integration realm and climbed to the late stage of the body integration realm. As expected of the mysterious Heaven 9 stage tribulation, merely 3 tribulation lightning bolts were able to temper your strength to such an extent. Prince Forio smiled faintly. However, it's a pity that after the tribulation lightning, I will kill you immediately. I won't give you any chance. Prince Forio didn't make a move now. It wasn't because he was arrogant, but because Qin Chuan was undergoing the tribulation. He didn't want to provoke the laws of heaven and earth and be tainted with karma that he shouldn't be tainted with. Once he was tainted with karma, he would have to bear the tribulation lightning that should have been Qin Chuan's after Qin Chuan died. Furthermore, the power of the tribulation lightning might change because of this. Prince Forio didn't want to bear such a risk. Therefore, Prince Forio had to patiently wait for Qin Chuan to overcome this small tribulation before making a move to kill Qin Chuan. He could still wait for this bit of time. Chapter 1257. When he saw Prince Fro standing there quietly without any movement, Qin Chuan's mood became even heavier. The calmer and more patient Prince Fro was, the more dangerous Qin Chuan felt. This was the first time he faced a transcending tribulation stage existence. Perhaps it would also be the last time. When the 9 lightning bolts fell, Qin Chuan's cultivation had already reached the late unity stage. Just as Prince Fro was about to make a move, he unexpectedly discovered that the tribulation cloud above Qin Chuan's head did not disperse. Instead, it became even thicker. This is consecutive tribulations? Prince Fro was somewhat astonished. He had lived for over 10,000 years, but this was the first time he had encountered such a thing. As everyone knew, when a cultivator reached the unity stage, as long as the fusion of energy in their body reached a certain level, they could trigger the lightning tribulation to break through to the next small realm. In theory, as long as the fusion of energy in their body was perfect enough, they could directly reach the peak of the unity stage when they advanced from the Dongshu stage to the unity stage. For example, when Qin Chuan advanced to the unity stage, he skipped the early unity stage and directly entered the mid-unity stage. This meant that the fusion of energy in Qin Chuan's body had reached the standard of the mid-unity stage. Another example was Zhou Lin and Lu Zi. When they advanced to the unity stage, they fused with only one type of power of law. Moreover, they were the most proficient in it. Therefore, after they transcended their tribulations, they could directly enter the late unity stage. Although this kind of situation existed, it was relatively rare. Normally, it would only happen to exceptional geniuses with exceptional talent. As for Qin Chuan's consecutive tribulations, this was unprecedented. There might not be anyone like this in the future. Long ago, the fusion of energy in Qin Chuan's body had already reached the standard of the peak unity stage. However, because of this series of events, Qin Chuan did not choose to transcend his tribulation. Now that he was facing the threat of Prince Fro, Qin Chuan had no choice but to use the tribulation to stall for time. This was a method that could not be helped, and Qin Chuan's method successfully made Prince Fro give up temporarily. What an interesting little fellow! Prince Fro was suddenly interested in Qin Chuan. If it wasn't for the fact that Qin Chuan must die, he would have imprisoned Qin Chuan by his side and studied Qin Chuan. Although Qin Chuan had triggered the lightning tribulation once again, the lightning tribulation would eventually come to an end. When the 2nd and 9th lightning tribulation descended, the tribulation cloud above Qin Chuan's head finally dissipated. At this time, Prince raised his hand raised his hand and punched Qin Chuan. This fist looked very ordinary, just like a punch from an ordinary person. It didn't seem to have any special characteristics, but this fist made Qin Chuan feel just how small and insignificant he was. The terrifying pressure caused Qin Chuan's body to collapse on the spot. Blood splattered everywhere, and the powerful aura that had just broken through to the peak of the Unity stage instantly withered away. Death. Duong. Along with an earth-shaking explosion, Prince Fro's fist stopped a meter away from Qin Chuan. His fist was blocked. But the one who blocked the fist was not Qin Chuan, but the little armored dragon. Qin Chuan stared blankly at the little armored dragon that had blocked the fist for him. He was so shocked that he couldn't speak. It hurts. The little armored dragon looked pitifully at Qin Chuan. Its carapace had already cracked and its luster had dimmed. Clearly, the little armored dragon had paid a great price to block that fist. When he heard the little armored dragon say the word pain, Qin Chuan abruptly woke up from his shock. Without hesitation, he used the space traversing technique, wanting to bring the little armored dragon away from this place. However, Prince Forio's second attack came. Time reversal. In a moment of desperation, Qin Chuan had no choice but to borrow the power of the law of time again. He wanted to reverse time and make Prince Fro withdraw his second attack. But facing the power of time reversal, Prince Fro's attack only paused for a breath's time before it directly bombarded Qin Chuan. So, Qin Chuan hugged the little armored dragon and rushed into the different space. Prince Fro's attack directly shattered the space door that Qin Chuan had opened and chased him into the different space. Sky Break. Qin Chuan used the third transformation of the Dragon Pearl's 9 transformations, Sky Break, to block Prince Fro's attack. But Sky Break only lasted for a moment before collapsing. Sky Fall. With a roar, Qin Chuan used the fourth transformation of the Dragon Pearl's 9 transformations. This attack was enough to shatter the heavens, but it only caused Prince Fro's attack to pause for a moment. Qin Chuan seemed to have gone mad. He continuously used Leifa Qianjun, Sky Break, and other powerful moves. But he was still unable to break away from Prince Fro's attack, and was still in a dangerous situation. Seeing that he was about to arrive at the space door on the other side of the space travel technique and leave the different space, Qin Chuan fiercely clenched his teeth and brazenly used the power of the law of space to disturb the space around him, setting off a space storm. In this space storm, Qin Chuan's entire body seemed to have been cut by knives. Thousands of wounds appeared all over his body. Blood crazily gushed out and he seemed to be on the verge of death. And after paying such an astonishing price, Qin Chuan finally used the space storm to change the direction of Prince Fro's attack and break away from the pursuit. In the distance, Prince Fro, who had victory in his grasp, suddenly revealed a surprised expression and said in a low voice, "He actually broke away from the pursuit." Prince Fro did not expect that Qin Chuan actually had the ability to break away from this attack. This little guy who looked like an ant was indeed not to be underestimated. But it doesn't matter. In order to break away from this attack, he is already on the verge of death. He can't escape. Prince Fro walked in the direction that Qin Chuan had escaped. He was as calm and collected as if he was strolling in his own backyard. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared without a trace. Bang! Qin Chuan, who was covered in blood, fell out of the space door that was about to collapse and fell to the ground with a bang. Qin Chuan. Vio looked at Qin Chuan, who was covered in blood and was shocked. He hurriedly extended his hand to support Qin Chuan. But at this moment, it could be said that Qin Chuan's entire body was covered in cuts and bruises. He simply did not know where to start. "Go find Little Purple and Senior Sister and bring them back." Qin Chuan struggled to stand up. He pushed away Wei Ao, who was trying to help him up. He glanced at the incomplete interstellar teleportation array glyph, gritted his teeth, and let out a low roar. He had sacrificed his brain region in exchange for a large amount of mental strength. Whoosh! Qin Chuan resisted the intense pain in his head that felt like it was about to explode. He held the Qilin pen in his hand and in a flash, he arrived at the completed array and began to inscribe the interstellar teleportation array again. This was their only hope to escape from this place. They must not give up. Chapter 1258. When Wei Ao brought LVZ and Zhou Lin back to Logistics Planet Number 3, what they saw was Qin Chuan, who was covered in blood and had a withered aura. When they saw Qin Chuan, Lu Zi and the other two all found a strong death aura from Qin Chuan's body. Their eyes widened in horror and they panicked. At the same time, the interstellar teleportation rune array on the ground suddenly lit up with a bright light. Qin Chuan actually completed the last stroke of the inscription rune array and activated the rune array. Go! Everyone go! Hearing Qin Chuan's low roar, Vio woke up from his dream and immediately mobilized the army to leave Logistics Planet Number 3 in an orderly manner through the interstellar teleportation rune array. As for where the other end leads to, they didn't care. With Prince Furio's speed, it only took 10 minutes to arrive at Logistics Planet Number 3. When he saw the fleet swarming towards a huge interstellar teleportation rune array, Prince Furio's face immediately became gloomy. He raised his hand and crushed the interstellar teleportation rune array, blocking the fleet's path. But after crushing the interstellar teleportation rune array, Prince Furio regretted it. He shouldn't have destroyed the interstellar teleportation rune array like this. He should have chased after them. That Qin Chuan still escaped. Prince Furio's face was gloomy. He sensed Qin Chuan's aura from the collapsed interstellar teleportation rune array, but he didn't find Qin Chuan's aura around Logistics Planet Number 3. Obviously, Qin Chuan had escaped through the interstellar teleportation rune array. But why is there an interstellar teleportation rune array here? Prince Furio couldn't understand these questions, but it didn't prevent him from venting his anger on the One God Sex fleet that didn't have time to leave Logistics Planet Number 3 through the interstellar teleportation rune array. A huge interstellar teleportation rune array suddenly appeared in Augustus. At this moment, the Zerg soldiers who were resting in Augustus raised their heads in surprise and looked at the interstellar teleportation rune array in the sky. Wasn't the teleportation rune array turned off? Who opened the portal again? While Zerg's soldiers were thinking about this, a green spaceship that looked like a towering tree slowly passed through the interstellar transmission array and came to the sky above Augustus. Behind this spaceship were countless battleships of the Tian people and the One God religion. Seeing this scene, the Zerg in Augustus finally realized the seriousness of the matter. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! While the Zerg soldiers in Augustus gathered to form a defensive line, the Hope had no intention of stopping above Augustus. Instead, it headed straight for the Celestial Cluster. The Tian People's fleet and the One God's fleet followed closely behind the Hope. Other than randomly firing a few shots at Augustus to create chaos, they didn't stop moving forward at all. Soon, the gathered Zerg troops discovered this situation. The coalition fleet that suddenly appeared in the sky above Augustus through the interstellar transmission rune array didn't seem to be here to attack Augustus, but to pass through. However, looking at the endless stream of battleships flying out of the interstellar transmission rune array, Zerg's troops didn't launch an attack. By the time the interstellar teleportation rune array was shut down, there were already close to 10,000 warships flying out of it. It was at this moment that the insectoids finally received orders from their superiors, and with common sense, they launched an attack on the tail of this enormous fleet. When Zerg's troops assumed an offensive posture, the dozens of battleships at the tail immediately took the lead and opened fire. The war started again. On the Hope, Qin Chuan, who was covered in blood, sat on the ground with his back against the wall, motionless. If it weren't for his weak breathing, Lu Zi would have thought that Qin Chuan was dead. What should we do to help him? Lu Zi looked at Qinchuan's pitiful state and her heart ached. He told us before, don't touch him, don't care about him. Zhou Lin pursed her lips and said, we just need to protect him now. Bai Yu walked out from the control room and said to everyone, we have arrived at the Augustus Nebula and are heading towards the celestial planet. At full speed, it will take us 10 days to enter the celestial cluster. At the same time, Bai Yu looked at Qinchuan and said, how is he? Not good. Zhou Lin sighed, Prince Fro is still too strong. Zhou Lin didn't see the scene of Qinchuan and Prince Fro fighting. No, it shouldn't be called fighting, it should be said that Prince Fro single-handedly crushed Qinchuan. Although she didn't know what happened, she was very clear that it must be Prince Fro who caused Qinchuan to become like this, and Prince Fro might not have used his full strength. We've already worked very hard. Lu Zi bit her lower lip and her face was filled with unwillingness. They had already worked very hard to cultivate and improve themselves, but the enemies they faced were getting stronger and stronger. They were always powerless at the most crucial moment, causing Qinchuan to be unable to do anything. You can't blame us, the situation in the universe is changing too quickly. Zhou Lin comforted LVZ, and at the same time, she comforted herself. If they had continued to develop step by step, they would have been able to advance to the crossing calamity stage sooner or later and become supreme existences. However, the war had broken out before they had fully grown up. The situation had deteriorated to this point, and they were powerless to do anything. Qinchuan had cultivated for less than 50 years, and Prince Fro had lived for at least 10,000 years. If Qinchuan was given 10,000 years, Zhou Lin believed that Prince Fro would be nothing in front of Qinchuan. Unfortunately, this was just an if. The enemy wouldn't give them 10,000 years. Lu Zi understood what Zhou Lin said, but she still blamed herself in her heart. At this moment, Vio came. He looked exhausted. He first took a look at Qinchuan's situation, then sighed and said, Prince Fro appeared on Logistics Planet number 3 and destroyed the interstellar teleportation array, causing the 100 million soldiers behind to not be able to teleport with us. I've already left some soldiers behind to block Zerg's pursuit for us. Right now, there are only about 400 million soldiers that can go to the celestial cluster with us. The Tian people have already contacted the Tian people. Io Star Cloud will send reinforcements to pick us up. We should be safe. Speaking up to here, Wei Ao once again looked at Qinchuan with an extremely complicated expression. There was helplessness, sadness, and most of all, guilt. He didn't know if Qinchuan could survive, but he knew that he owed Qinchuan a debt that he would never be able to repay in this lifetime. Chapter 1259. Qinchuan's current situation was very bad, but it wasn't to the point where he couldn't be saved. When he blocked Prince Furo's second attack, the runic sword wanted to help, but it was stopped by Qinchuan because the runic sword had something more important to do. After Qinchuan returned to Logistics Planet 3, it had to help Qinchuan suppress the collapse of his brain due to the exchange of large amounts of mental strength. The brain was the most mysterious and crucial part of the human body. If it completely collapsed, even if Qinchuan was still alive, he would become a retard. The runic sword was the insurance that Qinchuan gave himself. With the runic sword, he could fight to the end. In order to inscribe the interstellar teleportation rune array in one day, Qinchuan paid the price of the collapse of his brain and a whole 1,000 years of lifespan. Perhaps some people would think that Qinchuan had done enough to protect the Deus cluster, and there was no need to pay the price of 1,000 years of lifespan and the collapse of his brain. However, for Qinchuan, this wasn't something that he had to do, but something that he didn't want to do. He wanted to save the soldiers on the front line to resist the invasion of the Nephilim race and Zerg, as well as to preserve some combat strength for the Void Empire that had yet to appear. Therefore, he did this. As for whether this would earn him a good reputation, and whether the border army would be grateful to him, Qin Chuan didn't think about it at all. After all, in that kind of situation, he wasn't in the mood to think about such things. It wouldn't be too late to think about it if he could survive. Now, the problem in front of Qin Chuan was how to repair his brain. Now that his collapsed brain was suppressed by the runic sword, there was still hope to save it. However, Qin Chuan had no idea how to do it. And before his brain was repaired, he couldn't wake up. Exchanging blows with a supreme existence like Prince Forio is still too forceful. Prince Forio's casual attack already requires me to use all my strength to barely block it. The disparity is truly too great. It's also too terrifying. If he wasn't forced into a corner, Qin Chuan wouldn't want to face Prince Forio alone. This experience also made Qin Chuan realize how terrifying a supreme existence in the tribulation stage was. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that if Prince Fro had treated Qin Chuan a little more seriously, Qin Chuan would have been gone. Perhaps it was because he was used to being high and mighty, coupled with the absolute suppression of those in the crossing calamity stage against those in the lower realms. It was difficult for Prince Forio to be serious when facing enemies in the lower realms. He always had a playful attitude. Just like when the Demon King's will descended, if it had directly killed Qin Chuan, then Qin Chuan would have been gone. However, Qin Chuan had escaped from the Demon King's shadow and Prince Forio's hands twice because of luck. Now, whether it was the Demon King or Prince Forio, they had already witnessed Qin Chuan's tenacity. If there was a next time, it would be very difficult for Qin Chuan to escape. How do I repair my brain? Facing his collapsed brain, Qin Chuan was at his wits' end. In the past, the most serious injury his brain suffered was just a crack. This time, it had completely collapsed. The situation was completely different. Just when Qin Chuan didn't know how to repair his brain, the runic sword suddenly transmitted a message to Qin Chuan. It was an image. In the image, a black-robed man with a blurry face was sitting cross-legged in a cultivation room. He was in the middle of cultivating. Suddenly, the man's brain exploded and turned into a mass of chaos. When this happened, the man's mind suddenly soared and broke through the barrier of the core condensation stage. Seeing this, Qin Chuan was shocked. Could there be a higher mental strength realm above the core condensation stage? Just when Qin Chuan was thinking about this, the runic sword transmitted another message to Qin Chuan. Without destruction, there can be no construction. Destruction and construction. This is the spirit condensation stage, and can become a level 8 talisman formation master. After receiving the message from the runic sword, Qin Chuan was shocked. Level 8 talisman formation master. Wouldn't that be able to contend against the supreme existence of the crossing calamity stage? However, Qin Chuan also knew that when his mental strength advanced to the spirit condensation stage, he only had the possibility of becoming a level 8 talisman formation master. If he wanted to become a level 8 talisman formation master, he first had to have a level 8 talisman formation master. In addition, Qin Chuan was very curious. Since there was a spirit condensation stage above the core condensation stage, why had he never heard of anyone mentioning the spirit condensation stage before? Also, who was the blurry man in the image? In response to Qin Chuan's question, the runic sword responded for the first time. The man in black was you. He was also the only person in the universe who cultivated his mental strength to the spirit condensation stage. In other words, you created an even more powerful spirit condensation stage on the foundation of the core condensation stage. When he received this answer from the runic sword, Qin Chuan wasn't surprised at all. This was because he had already guessed that other than you, no one else could make the runic sword store memories and cultivate it to the spirit condensation stage. If you can do it, then so can I. Since the runic sword transmitted this image to him, it meant that the runic sword felt that he had the ability to become the second person after you to reach the spirit condensation stage. However, Qin Chuan's current physical condition was quite bad. It wasn't suitable for Qin Chuan to break through to the spirit condensation stage. Therefore, if Qin Chuan wanted to advance his mental strength to the spirit condensation stage and get the ticket to becoming a level 8 talisman formation master, he first had to heal his physical injuries. So now came the problem. Qin Chuan's consciousness couldn't wake up to control his own body. He could only pin his hopes on his companions. 7 days later, the border troops led by the Hope finally got rid of Zerg's army after paying a heavy price. They successfully met up with the Tian people's reinforcements and headed to the Io Nebula together. The Tian people's reinforcements, who were notified in advance, brought the Tian people's best healing potions to treat Qin Chuan's physical injuries. As for the collapse of his brain, the Tian people were helpless. When the border troops and the Tian people's reinforcements set off to return to the Io Nebula, the border of the Deus cluster was completely breached. Under the command of Prince Furio, the Nephilim race's army marched straight into the only continent. At the same time, Zerg's army, led by Guru, had killed their way into the Io Nebula. The one god religion was in a state of emergency. However, even though the only continent was facing the threat of Zerg's army, Pope Saint Baudelo, who had disappeared, still hadn't shown up. God Lord Apollo also hadn't shown up. At this point, the one god religion's rule in the Deus cluster was almost over. Chapter 1260. The Heavenly Void Continent. Fidect looked at the heavenly void continent that was moving slowly in front of him, his face expressionless. The subordinates who went to the heavenly void continent to scout for information had returned, and they brought Fidect some bad news. The heavenly void continent was now empty, and there was not a single soul left. In other words, everyone on the heavenly void continent had already left before they arrived. We miss them. Fidec's expression did not change. He was not surprised by this. If Golaska still stayed on the heavenly void continent after knowing that they had arrived at the great demonic star cluster, he would be too stupid. They're just a bunch of stray dogs. So what if they escaped? They can't do anything. A white-haired wizard in a black robe standing beside Fidec sneered, as if he was very disdainful of the former royal family of the Void Empire. Fidec glanced at the wizard beside him and said, "The Arcane Church is still alive." "So what?" The wizard sneered. "How much power does the Arcane Church have now?" Fidec frowned slightly and said, "You'll pay the price for underestimating them like this." "Then we'll talk about this after we pay the price." The wizard was unmoved and said, "Marshal, you're overestimating them." In the wizard's eyes, if the Arcane Church really had power, the former royal family would not have fled in such a panic. Fidect did not continue this topic in the face of the wizard's attitude. He changed the topic and said, "Skeletal Horse, lead the wizards from the headquarters to the only continent. Represent the Void Empire and attack the only continent together with the demons and Zerg. Completely destroy the Deus cluster and occupy the Deus cluster." "Yes, sir." The skeletal horse agreed. It loved killing people the most. When the border troops and Tian people's reinforcements returned to Io Nebula, Lu Zi and her team immediately sent Qin Chuan to the best medical room in the logistics base for treatment. Under the all-out treatment of the Tian people's doctors, Qin Chuan's physical wounds were basically healed in just 1 day. It was also at this time that Qin Chuan began to try to break through and then rebuild, and the strength of his spiritual power reached the level of spirit concentrating. After repeatedly confirming that Qin Chuan was ready, the runic sword released the suppression on his collapsing brain. The moment the suppression was released, Qin Chuan's brain immediately continued to collapse. Qin Chuan's face immediately showed an expression of extreme pain. This performance frightened many of the doctors in the infirmary. They were about to report Qin Chuan's situation when an extremely terrifying spiritual force swept through the infirmary. Everything in the infirmary was impacted by this terrifying mental power. The doctors bled from their orifices and fainted on the spot. Bang! In the infirmary, all the medical equipment exploded with a loud bang and turned into ruins. After the infirmary was no longer blocked by the infirmary, this powerful mental power immediately radiated in all directions, causing all the medical equipment within 1,000 miles of the logistics base to malfunction. Everyone's brains suffered a huge impact. Those who were close to the infirmary immediately showed a painful expression, bleeding from their orifices. Even those who were far away fell into a state of sluggishness at this moment. Is the logistics base under attack? After noticing the abnormal situation in the logistics base, all the Tian people immediately rushed to the logistics base to check the situation. When the Tian people arrived at the logistics base and saw Qin Chuan flying in the air with his eyes closed, they were all stunned. What a powerful mental power! What a pure mental power! Tian San and Tian Si looked at Qin Chuan in the air and exclaimed almost at the same time. They had seen many talisman formation masters with powerful mental power, but this was the first time they had seen Qin Chuan with such a terrifying mental power. They felt that even 10 level 7 talisman formation masters together might not be able to match Qin Chuan's mental power. Has he recovered? Lu Zi looked at Qin Chuan in surprise and cheered to her companions beside her. Zhou Lin nodded and said, judging from Qin Chuan's performance, he should have woken up, and there is a high probability that he has profited from this disaster. As long as he wakes up, it's fine. Bai Yu breathed a sigh of relief and said, otherwise, I don't know how to explain it to everyone when we go back. At this time, Chen Chongqing, the representative of the human race, and Yao Rao, the representative of the demon race, were on their way to Io Star Cloud. They didn't know that Qin Chuan was injured. Fortunately, Qin Chuan had recovered at this time. Otherwise, when Chen Chongqing and Yao Rao arrived, they really didn't know how to face them. Just when everyone was surprised by the sudden change in Qin Chuan's body, Qin Chuan was also stunned. My brain has collapsed and I have advanced to the divine condensation stage. My mental power is no longer limited by my brain. It's almost endless. This discovery made Qin Chuan very surprised. His mental power was no longer limited by his brain, which meant that he could continue to cultivate. In theory, there was no limit. This was absolutely a good thing for Qin Chuan, who often relied on talisman formations to fight. Now, Qin Chuan was already at the peak of the combination realm. As long as he took the last step to break through to the peak of the combination realm, he could try to advance to the crossing calamity stage. However, before he was completely sure, Qin Chuan wouldn't act rashly. And once Qin Chuan advanced to the crossing calamity stage, the rune sword could use the power of the Sea of Runes to increase the power of the talisman formations for Qin Chuan. It could increase the power of the 7th level battle formations that Qin Chuan had mastered to the 8th level battle formations. For Qin Chuan, this was absolutely an unprecedented improvement. However, all of this still existed in Qin Chuan's imagination. He really wanted to reach that step, but he still needed some time. When Qin Chuan slowly withdrew his mental power, the surrounding mental power storm also dissipated. Qin Chuan slowly opened his eyes and glanced at the messy logistics base under his feet. Then, he looked at the crowd not far away and smiled. Sorry, I seem to have made a lot of noise. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Tian San laughed and said, It's okay, it's okay. Your improvement is good for us. Although a lot of equipment was destroyed, everyone is still alive. Whoosh! Lu Zi flew out of the crowd and threw herself at Qin Chuan. She hugged Qin Chuan tightly in her arms. She was emotional, but she couldn't say a word. Qin Chuan smiled and patted Lu Zi's back gently. Sorry, I made you worry. Don't try to be brave in the future. Lu Zi glanced at Qin Chuan's gray hair and felt distressed. That was the sign of losing a lot of vitality. Put yourself in a desperate situation and fight to live. There can be no construction without destruction. Qin Chuan smiled. If he had to choose again, he would still do the same. Chapter 1261. Qinchuan's awakening was a good thing for everyone, especially for the remaining 300 million soldiers of the One God religion. Qinchuan was their savior. Qinchuan had fallen into a deep sleep due to his serious injuries in order to save them. If Qinchuan was unable to wake up, they would have to live with guilt and self-blame for the rest of their lives. Qinchuan, it's great that you've woken up. Tears streamed down Vaio's face. Ever since he became a cardinal, other than worrying about the situation of the One God religion, this was the first time he had been so concerned about an outsider. It was Qinchuan, whom he had once thought of as an outsider, who had helped them resist the attacks of the devil race time and time again. He had also extended a helping hand to them when they were at their most desperate, saving them from a hopeless situation. Therefore, Vaio was really grateful to Qinchuan. His kindness was akin to giving him a new lease of life. Qinchuan chuckled as he looked at Vaio's agitated and teary face. You are a red-cloaked archbishop after all. Don't be so emotional. Things have already passed, and we should look forward. If you really want to thank me, then lead the soldiers of the One God religion to fight against the enemy bravely and take back everything you have lost. Vaio nodded vigorously and said to Qinchuan in a firm tone, We will definitely take back what we have lost. After saying this, Vaio suddenly said to Qinchuan, However, I came to see you today not to show my determination, but because the Pope wants to see you. Upon hearing this, Qinchuan raised his eyebrows slightly and said, Saint Bodlo? He's also here? Vaio nodded and said, Just 2 days ago, the Pope and the Divine Master arrived at the Io Nebula together and successfully joined us. Upon hearing Vaio's words, Qinchuan smiled and asked, Didn't you ask them where they were during the Deus Cluster's most dangerous time? Qinchuan did not have a good impression of Pope Saint Bodlo and the Divine Master Apollo. When everyone in the Deus Cluster was fighting hard, these two representatives of the One God religion, who were also the strongest fighters, had disappeared without a trace. Now that the Deus Cluster was about to fall, they had appeared in the relatively safe Io Nebula. This was too ridiculous. Upon hearing Qinchuan's words, Vaio could not help but fall silent. Vaio could understand Qinchuan's feelings, but there were some things that Qinchuan could say without scruples, but he could not say them. In fact, how could he not want an explanation in his heart? Qinchuan could see Vaio's difficulties. He reached out and patted Vaio's shoulder gently. He said to Vaio, There are some things that are inconvenient for you to do. Let me seek justice for those innocent souls who have died. Qinchuan, you. Vaio wanted to speak, but Qinchuan had already brushed past him. When Qinchuan arrived at the camp specially prepared by the Tian people for the higher-ups of the One God religion, he finally saw Pope Saint Bodlo. In the past, Qinchuan had heard of Saint Bodlo's name several times, but this was the first time he had seen Saint Bodlo with his own eyes. Saint Bodlo was a white-haired old man who looked benevolent, but Qinchuan did not have a good impression of him, not only because of past grievances, but also because of Saint Bodlo's inaction during this period of time. Without waiting for Saint Bodlo to speak, Qinchuan asked, Do you know how many people have died at the border in the past 6 months? Upon hearing Qinchuan's words, Saint Bodlo was slightly stunned. He did not expect Qinchuan's first sentence to be this. If you don't know, then let me tell you. Qinchuan sneered. In the past 6 months, more than 700 million people have died at the border. More than 100 million of them belong to the Tian people, and the other 600 million are all warriors of the One God religion. Saint Bodlo was silent for a moment and then said, I know. They have made a lot of efforts and sacrifices to protect the Deus Cluster. They are all respectable people. You don't know, Qinchuan emphasized again and said coldly, If you knew, you wouldn't be a coward. Qinchuan, there are some things you don't know. Please don't judge yourself. Ethan, who was standing next to Saint Bodlo, frowned slightly. He was very dissatisfied with Qinchuan's attitude toward Saint Bodlo. Qinchuan smiled and said to Ethan, "Do you like to be a bootlicker so much that you don't have to go to the battlefield in the end?" You. Ethan was furious and wanted to scold Qinchuan, but he was stopped by Saint Bodlo. Saint Bodlo looked calmly at Qinchuan and said, "What else do you want to say? You can say it all. I don't have much to say to you. I know that you are all high and mighty people. You think that as long as you are alive, the Deus cluster will not fall, and the one God religion will still exist. As for those warriors who have died and sacrificed themselves, they died a worthy death. Like chives, they can grow again after being cut, right?" Qinchuan's words made Saint Bodlo fall into silence again. In fact, what Qinchuan said was right. In the past, Saint Bodlo had thought that as long as he, the Pope, was still alive, the archbishops in red were still alive, and the high priest and priests were still alive, then the one God religion would not be considered to have collapsed and would still be intact. As for those warriors of the one God religion, they died to protect the Deus cluster and were loyal to the Church. Their deaths were worthy and meaningful, so there was no need to feel pity. But when he heard about what Qinchuan had done when facing Prince Fro, and when he saw the warriors of the one God religion who had survived because they followed Qinchuan and prayed for Qinchuan day and night, he was moved. Saint Bodlo had once wondered if those warriors would also pray for him if he fell into a deep sleep one day and could not wake up. Perhaps there would be, but it might not be sincere. Qinchuan, on the other hand, had received everyone's sincerity and recognition. If he, the Pope, were to issue an order to attack Qinchuan in the name of the Pope, what would the result be? Probably those warriors rescued by Qinchuan would not attack Qinchuan, and at the same time, the faith in their hearts would collapse. Saint Bodlo had never thought that there would be a day when an outsider would gain such great prestige in the one God religion and be loved and worshipped by so many people. As the Pope, Qinchuan had done something that he could not do. It had to be said that this was a kind of mockery to him. What was more ironic was that he had no way to refute it, because when everyone needed him the most, he stood by and watched. "You are right." After a long silence, Saint Bodlo slowly opened his mouth and sighed. Even though there were many reasons in his heart that could be explained, at this moment, Saint Bodlo did not want to make any explanations, because they were too weak and meaningless. Chapter 1262. When Qinchuan heard Saint Bodlo admit that he was right, he sneered again and said, "It seems that you are not completely bad. At least you dare to admit your mistakes. You can still be saved." Archbishop Ethan, who was standing at the side, said coldly, "Qinchuan, don't go too far. Now, the Pope is already a supreme existence in the tribulation stage. If it weren't for the fact that you saved so many soldiers of the one God religion, even if the Pope killed you with one palm, no one would be able to blame the Pope for your tone just now." Ethan was furious. He really didn't understand why Saint Bodlo would allow Qinchuan to mock him like this. "You're anxious, you're anxious." Qinchuan looked at Ethan with a playful smile on his face. "A cornered dog will jump over a wall." Ethan was furious when he heard Qinchuan's words. Just as he was about to flare up, Saint Bodlo sealed his mouth and waved his hand, sending him thousands of miles away. After sending Ethan away, Saint Bodlo sighed and said to Qinchuan, "What you said is right. I can understand your feelings. I met you today to express my gratitude to you in person. Everyone in the One God sect owes you a favor." Qinchuan shook his head and said, "You don't owe me. You owe the dead soldiers." Qinchuan then turned around and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave." Saint Bodlo looked at Qinchuan's back and said, "This time, I won't run away. I will appear on the battlefield as the vanguard to fight against the demons and Zerg." Qinchuan didn't even turn his head and said, "This is your own business. You don't need to explain it to me." After Qinchuan left, Ethan also returned from thousands of miles away. He looked at Saint Baudelo and asked in confusion, "Pope, why didn't you tell him that you didn't do nothing? You and the Divine Lord helped the relatives of the soldiers who died in the front line. Isn't this a good thing worth publicizing?" Upon hearing this, Saint Baudelo slowly turned his head to look at Ethan and said indifferently, "As an outsider, Qin Chuan can risk his life and sacrifice himself to rescue the soldiers of the One God religion. As the Pope of the One God religion, I've done something. What's there to publicize?" Ethan was stunned by Saint Baudelo's words. After Qin Chuan left the camp of the One God sect, he went to the Tian people's camp to meet the Tian people's higher-up. At this time, 6 of the 9 elders of the Tian people's Council of Elders had come to Io Star Cloud. Except for Tian San and Tian Si, who were in charge of the logistics base, the other 4 elders were commanding the defense at the front line. Seeing Qin Chuan's arrival, Tian San said to Qin Chuan, "We've learned about what happened at the front line of the Deus cluster. You're really amazing. You deserve to be called selfless." Qin Chuan waved his hand and said, "Don't flatter me, third elder." Qin Chuan sat down and asked Tian San, "Third elder, how many tribulation stage powerhouses do we have at the front line?" This question might need to be kept a secret from others, but it wasn't necessary for Qin Chuan to keep it a secret. Therefore, Tian San answered honestly, 2. One is Pope Saint Baudelo, and the other is God Lord Apollo. Qin Chuan was stunned for a moment and said, "The Divine Lord Apollo is also here?" Qin Chuan had thought that the Divine Lord Apollo had gone to hide in the rear. He didn't expect him to still be in Io Star Cloud. Tian San smiled and said to Qin Chuan, "I know you have a great prejudice against Saint Baudelo and Apollo because of some things, but the truth is not what you think. When Saint Baudelo and Apollo came to Io Star Cloud, they brought with them nearly 2 billion people of the Deus cluster. Most of these people are relatives of the soldiers who sacrificed at the front line." Qin Chuan was stunned for a moment after hearing Tian San's words. There was actually such a thing? But why didn't Saint Baudelo tell him before? Tian San knew that Qin Chuan had gone to see Saint Baudelo before. He said to Qin Chuan, "There are some things that he doesn't want to say, so he can only let others do it." Qin Chuan was silent for a moment and said, "My attitude towards him was a little bad just now." Tian San laughed and said, "Just because you saved hundreds of millions of soldiers of the One God sect at the front line, even if you pointed at Saint Baudelo's nose and scolded him, he couldn't say anything bad about you, let alone get angry at you." Qin Chuan scratched his head awkwardly and said, "Actually, I didn't think that my relationship with the One God sect would become like this one day." Tian San nodded in agreement and said, "That's true. None of us thought that things would develop like this. Now I'm actually glad that the demon race invaded. If they had waited until you and the One God sect fought to the death before provoking a war, it would have been troublesome." Qin Chuan asked Tian San, "How many supreme existences of the tribulation stage do the demon race have now?" Prince Furio of the demon race, Guru Zerg, and Marshal Fedetic of the Void Empire. Tian San said to Qin Chuan, "The supreme existences of the Tian people at the tribulation stage did not come here. Instead, they are guarding the rocky star. No matter what, the rear cannot be messed up." Qin Chuan nodded and agreed with the Tian people's approach. Now that the Deus cluster had fallen, the Io Nebula, as the gateway to the celestial cluster, was bound to be attacked by the demon race. If Zerg killed his way into the celestial cluster from the border of the rocky star at this time, it would be terrible. Therefore, they had to focus on guarding the rocky star. "Now, how's our combat strength in the Io Nebula?" Qin Chuan was a little curious and asked, "Is there any new information from the demon race?" Tian San replied, "We have now formed a coalition army. All the forces are mobilizing their forces to the Io Nebula. I estimate that in a month's time, the Io Nebula's military strength will reach more than 3 billion. At this point, Tian-san paused for a moment before continuing. As for the insectoids, their 200 million strong army is still there, and they haven't lost much. In addition to the fleet that sneaked into the God Star cluster, the insectoids should have around 300 million strong army. As for the demon race, nearly 1 billion troops have already rushed out of the Deus cluster. It is said that the demon race will mobilize more than 2 billion troops to enter the Deus cluster later. In the front, the difference between our military strength and theirs is not much. Qin Chuan thought for a moment and said, but in terms of combat strength, there should be a big difference. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Tian-san glanced at him and asked, "Why do you say that?" Qin Chuan looked at Tian-san and said seriously, "Those people only agreed to form a coalition army because of Zerg's sudden attack. Not to mention the combat strength of the troops they transferred, at the very least, their morale is a big problem." Chapter 1263. When Tian-san heard Qin Chuan mention people's hearts, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. If Qin Chuan could think of this problem, then he naturally thought of it as well. Don't look at the 3 billion soldiers of the Allied army. These 3 billion soldiers came from more than 20 different forces. Each force had their own ideas. Wanting to unify these 3 billion soldiers and command them like an extension of one's arm was too difficult. On the other hand, the Nephilim race only had 2 forces, Zerg and the Void Empire. These 3 forces could be divided into 3 battlefields and attack from 3 different angles. There wouldn't be any problems with each of them commanding their own troop. However, if more than 20 forces on their side were to command their own troops, then the Io star cloud would become a mess. They might not even be able to defend it for a day. I've also thought of this problem, but I haven't thought of how to solve it yet. Tian-san looked at Qin Chuan, hoping that Qin Chuan could give a more reasonable suggestion. Qin Chuan looked at Tian-san and said, "Before I give a suggestion, I want to ask, are those forces really sincere in joining the Allied army? Or are they forced to join the Allied army because of the threat of death?" In fact, Qin Chuan already had an answer to this question, but he still wanted to confirm it. He wanted to see if the attitude of those forces had changed recently. Tian-san smiled bitterly and said, "Is there even a need to ask? If the Nephilim race and Zerg really stop in the Deus cluster and don't move forward, then our Allied army will probably disperse tomorrow. If the various forces were sincere in forming an Allied army to resist the Nephilim race and Zerg together, then Tian-san wouldn't have to worry about this problem." Qin Chuan thought for a moment and asked, "Is it possible to break up their subordinates and form new troops? This should be easier to manage." "I've also thought of this method, but it won't work. Those people simply won't give up their authority. In their words, their troops will only be able to play the greatest role if they are commanded by themselves." Tian-san really couldn't find a suitable reason to refute the excuses of the various forces. "Can't you be more forceful?" Qin Chuan was puzzled. "The situation is already so bad, and they still want to play tricks with us. Why should we tolerate them?" Tian-san sighed and said, "Not all forces are like this. It's just that there are a few special ones." "Who?" Qin Chuan asked directly. When Tian-san heard Qin Chuan's words, his expression changed slightly as he asked, "What do you want to do?" "There are some things that are inconvenient for you to do, so let me do it," Qin Chuan said to Tian-san. "You Tian people need to have the demeanor of a great clan, but I don't need it." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Tian-san advised, "Don't act recklessly. Don't worry, I won't mess around. Just tell me who's behind it." Qin Chuan smiled. "I promise they'll willingly hand over their military power." As one of the major forces in the alliance, the Naga race had a complete planet in the Io Nebula as their base. The 80 million Naga soldiers had built Sang's star like an iron bucket. Even if the higher-ups of the Tian people wanted to enter, they would need the permission of the Naga commander. When Qin Chuan arrived at the periphery of Sangstar, he faced the patrolling soldiers of the Naga race and handed over his greeting card. Human Qin Chuan has come to visit Commander Hai Kuei of the Naga race. However, when Qin Chuan's greeting card was sent to Sangstar, it was like a stone sinking into the sea. Qin Chuan waited for 2 hours but didn't receive a response. Is your commander sleeping? Qin Chuan looked at the patrolling soldiers of the Naga race and asked, or is there a serious problem with the network delay of your optical computer? Facing Qin Chuan's question, the patrolling soldiers of the Naga race looked gloomy and said, this is not something you need to worry about. When Qin Chuan heard this, he grinned and said, this is probably called refusing a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Before his voice fell, Qin Chuan's figure had already disappeared. The patrolling soldiers of the Naga race were stunned for a moment before their faces changed. They immediately reported, Qin Chuan has disappeared. He forced his way in. When this information was sent to Hai Kuei's face changed slightly. He said to Hai Luo, who was sitting to the side, Qin Chuan broke in. Hai Luo coldly snorted and said, if he really dares to break in, then we will directly take action and kill him for trespassing. Hai Kuei frowned slightly and said, isn't this a bit too much? Hai Kuei was still aware of some of the things Qin Chuan had done at the front lines of the Deus cluster. If they killed Qin Chuan just like that, it would inevitably cause some criticism. Hai Luo looked at Hai Kuei and said in a deep voice, Big brother, back then, Qin Chuan humiliated me in public. He humiliated our entire Naga race. We have to vent this anger. What nonsense are you talking about? At this moment, a low voice sounded in the hall. Qin Chuan had unknowingly entered the hall and stood in front of Hai Kuei and Hai Luo. Seeing Qin Chuan suddenly appear, Hai Kuei and Hai Luo were shocked. Just as they were about to speak, Qin Chuan beat them to it and said, when I attacked you, it was because you attacked me first. I was just defending myself. After you lost, I didn't cause any trouble for you. That matter has long since passed for me. I didn't expect you to still remember it and want to kill me. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Hai Kuei immediately said, Qin Chuan, you misunderstood. Commander Hai Kuei of the Naga race, right? Qin Chuan looked at Hai Kuei and smiled. I have never humiliated the Naga race. Moreover, I feel that a brainless thing like Hai Luo has no right to represent the Naga race. Qin Chuan, you have gone too far. Hai Luo couldn't bear it anymore. He immediately raised his hand to attack Qin Chuan. However, his attack was like child's play in front of Qin Chuan. He could easily resolve it. At the same time, Qin Chuan used a space imprisonment technique to imprison Hai Luo. Then, he said to Hai Kuei, Commander, this is a personal grudge between me and him. Please don't interfere. Qin Chuan, Hai Kuei wanted to stop Qin Chuan, but Qin Chuan had already used a space travel technique to leave. He didn't give Hai Kuei a chance to speak at all. Seeing Qin Chuan take Hai Luo away, Hai Kuei's face became extremely ugly. He immediately contacted Tian San, wanting Tian San to protect Hai Luo. However, at this critical moment, he couldn't contact Tian San. At the same time, Lu Zi sent invitations in Qin Chuan's name to the Bronze Race, the Big Stone Race, the Rain Race, and the Oil Race. She invited the commanders of these races to attend a banquet on Rhea. Qin Chuan's reputation was widespread. In the face of Qin Chuan's invitation, the commanders of the various races didn't refuse. They all agreed to attend the banquet on Rhea. They wanted to see the new leader of the human race. Chapter 1264. When the commanders of the various races arrived at Laya, they all received news from the Naga commander, Hai Kuei. Qin Chuan captured Hai Luo. When they heard the news, the expressions of the commanders changed slightly. It seemed that this banquet was not going to be a good one. However, since they were already here, they naturally couldn't back down and leave. As a result, the various commanders were led to the banquet hall by the attendants. However, to everyone's surprise, the banquet hall was completely empty. Apart from a single table, there was no food at all, let alone any alcohol. While the commanders were confused, Qin Chuan slowly walked down the stairs from the second floor. He smiled and said to everyone in the hall, "I am Qin Chuan. It is my honor to be able to attend this banquet." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, the commander of the bronze race, Tong Tong, looked at Qin Chuan and said with a fake smile, "Qin Chuan, you invited us to attend this banquet. Why is there no food at all?" Qin Chuan looked at Tong Tong, whose body seemed to be made of bronze, and smiled. "Tonight, I invited everyone to eat an all-fish banquet." Hearing this, everyone's expression changed slightly. They could not help but think of Hai Luo, who was captured by Qin Chuan. Could it be that Qin Chuan really dared to? Just as everyone was thinking about this, a dozen attendants walked in from the side door with a huge metal basin. In the metal basin, a huge greenish-gray fish was lying in it. It was quiet and motionless, and all kinds of cooking seasonings were sprinkled on the fish's body. The fragrance of the cooking seasoning filled the air. Dong! The waiters put the huge iron basin on the table. Qin Chuan smiled and pointed at the big fish in the iron basin. He asked everyone, "Commanders, what do you think of this big fish? Is it enough for you to eat?" Everyone looked at the motionless big fish in the iron basin. Their expressions became extremely strange. They all recognized that the big fish in the iron basin was Hai Luo. However, they did not know what method Qin Chuan used to make Hai Luo's body smaller. "This big fish seems to be imprisoned?" The commander of the big stone race, Shi Jing, looked at Hai Luo, who was being treated like an all-fish banquet. The corner of his mouth twitched. Qin Chuan's move was too ruthless. If this matter spread out, Hai Luo would really become a laughingstock. Qin Chuan smiled faintly and said, "This big fish is dishonest, so I use the power of the laws of space to imprison him. If you want to give him back his freedom, you can give it a try and see if you can break free from this imprisonment." When she heard Qin Chuan, Shi Jing silently touched the spatial shackles, and she couldn't help but be shocked. Even with her attainments in the laws of space, she was actually unable to shake the spatial shackles in the slightest. The commanders of the other clans also gave it a try. They were all shocked by Qin Chuan's attainments in the spatial laws. While the commanders were trying, Qin Chuan waved his hand. Suddenly, a fire was lit under the iron basin. He began to cook the big fish. The big fish's eyes looked around in fright, but its body was unable to move. The sudden fire also gave the commanders a fright. From the looks of it, Qin Chuan was really planning to eat Hai Luo? "Qin Chuan, your joke is a bit too much." The Rain Clan's commander, Shui Gu, frowned slightly. He was dissatisfied with Qin Chuan's way of doing things. Qin Chuan smiled. He looked at the soaked Shui Gu and said, "I heard that Commander Shui has always been good at controlling water. You have extremely high attainments in the law of water. Why don't you try and see if you can extinguish this fire?" Faced with Qin Chuan's provocation, Shui Gu coldly snorted. He waved his hand and a stream of water rushed towards the fire under the iron basin. However, under the impact of the water, the fire wasn't affected at all. Not only did it not seem like it was going to be extinguished, but it became even more vigorous. This change caused Shui Ji's expression to become unsightly. "Who else wants to try?" Qin Chuan smiled at the oilman commander, Yu Yi, and said, "Commander Yu Yi, there's no need to try. I'm afraid this boiled fish will become grilled fish in the end." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Yu Yi sighed and said, "Qin Chuan, why can't we sit down and have a good talk?" Qin Chuan smiled and said, "We can have a good talk, but it's better to wait until after the complete fish feast." At this time, the water in the iron basin was boiling. All kinds of seasonings and spices were cooked, and a fragrant aroma spread in the hall. When everyone smelled the aroma, they all subconsciously swallowed their saliva. This scene was seen by the big fish that couldn't move, and its entire body collapsed. At this moment, Lu Zi's figure suddenly appeared beside Qinchuan and said, "Commander Hai Kuei of the Naga clan came uninvited." Qinchuan smiled and said, "Let senior sister entertain Commander Hai Kuei. I don't want to see him today. These are my distinguished guests." Hearing Qinchuan's words, Tong Tong frowned and said, "We are good friends with Hai Kuei. Why don't we invite Hai Kuei over?" Qinchuan shook his head and said indifferently, "You guests should just follow the host." Although Qinchuan's tone was flat, the unquestionable attitude contained in it was clear. This also made the commanders present understand that Qinchuan was determined to make an example of the Naga clan to deter them. Kill the chicken to warn the monkey. Obviously, in Qinchuan's eyes, they were a group of monkeys. Thinking of this, the expressions of the commanders of the various races couldn't help but become a little ugly. However, they had already tried to break Qinchuan's space imprisonment technique and extinguish the fire, but they had all failed. This proved that Qinchuan's strength was far above theirs. If they fell out with Qinchuan, they might not be able to get any benefit. "Qinchuan, we are all part of the coalition army. You are going too far." As a last resort, Shi Jing could only use righteousness to suppress Qinchuan, hoping that Qinchuan could restrain himself. However, as soon as Shi Jing's voice fell, Qinchuan laughed and said, "Do you really think that you are part of the coalition army? Why do I hear that some people refuse to hand over their military power and are unwilling to go to the front line in order to preserve their own strength? Are you all here to be cheerleaders?" In the face of Qinchuan's ridicule, the faces of the commanders of the various races became extremely gloomy. They couldn't help but want to fall out with him. However, in the face of the smiling Qinchuan, they were a little scared. Right at this moment, LVZ returned, and she even brought along a palm-sized fish scale. Qinchuan, Commander Hai Kuei of the Naga clan, specially sent a gift to attend the banquet. Lu Zi looked at the green fish scale in her hand and said to Qinchuan, "The order of the Naga clan commander is here. The one who holds the order is the commander." Chapter 1265. Of course, Hai Kuei knew why Qinchuan had captured Hai Luo. At first, he hoped to join forces with other forces to pressure Qinchuan. However, when he realized that this path was not feasible, Hai Kuei had no choice but to hand over the token in exchange for Hai Luo. Perhaps Qinchuan was just threatening him and would not really cook Hai Luo, but Hai Kuei did not dare to take the risk. Qinchuan looked at the green fish scale in his hand and put it away with a smile. Then, he waved his hand and withdrew the power of imprisonment. The big fish in the iron basin immediately jumped up and fell to the ground with a bang. The big fish kept twisting its body on the ground. Its abdomen was obviously red from the heat. If it came out later, it would have been cooked. Seeing that Hai Luo, who had been turned into a big fish, had been saved, everyone was relieved. However, at this moment, Qinchuan said with a smile, "Since we can't eat the all-fish feast, what should we eat now?" As he spoke, Qinchuan's gaze swept across Tong Tong, Shi Jing, Shui Gu, and Ye. The meaning in his gaze was self-evident. Just as the commanders were furious and wanted to speak, they unexpectedly found that their bodies could no longer move. Space imprisonment. Almost subconsciously, everyone thought of this in their hearts. They were shocked, but their faces still maintained their anger and could not be changed. Qinchuan looked at the four people in front of him and said, "Now, I will give you a chance. I wonder if you are willing to take this opportunity?" As he spoke, Qinchuan casually tossed the green fish scale in his hand that represented the status of the Naga tribe's commander. Everyone looked at the green fish scale in Qinchuan's hand. How could they not know what Qinchuan meant? It was just that they were really unwilling to hand over their military power. However, when their bodies involuntarily left the ground and flew towards the fragrant iron basin in front of them, they were afraid. They were unwilling to become a delicacy in this boiling water, so they could only choose to submit. When Qin Chuan appeared in front of Tian San with the tokens of the 5 great forces led by the Naga clan, Tian San didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The Naga race has 80 million soldiers, the Rain clan has 100 million soldiers, the Stone tribe has 100 million soldiers, the Oil tribe has 80 million soldiers, and the Bronze tribe has 120 million soldiers. Qin Chuan casually threw the tokens of the 5 forces in front of Tian San with a calm expression. With the surrender of these 5 forces, the other forces would most likely obediently hand over their tokens and forces, and would no longer put up any resistance. Tian San looked at the token in front of him and said to Qin Chuan, "I'm afraid your all-fish feast will scare them to death. If they don't hand over their military power and the token, will you really dare to take action?" Qin Chuan chuckled and said, "Unfortunately, they didn't dare to gamble and chose to hand over their authority." I'm impressed. Tian San really admired Qin Chuan for daring to do so. Moreover, probably only someone like Qin Chuan, who had reached a certain level of strength in the body integration realm, would have the confidence to do such a thing without fear of backlash. I've already taken care of the most difficult thorn for you. The rest is up to you. If Tian San couldn't even take care of the remaining small and medium-sized forces, then Qin Chuan would really despise Tian San. Don't worry, leave the rest to me. Tian San was in high spirits. As long as we can put everyone's strength in one place, we can definitely defeat the enemy. After a brief chat with Tian San, Qin Chuan left the Tian people's camp and returned to Rhea Star. When Qin Chuan returned to Rhea Star, he happened to see a carrier-class spaceship landing at Rhea Star's interstellar port. The carrier-class spaceship was called the Princess, which Qin Chuan had ridden before. It was Sharmilla's ride. "Boss!" A burst of excited shouts came from the deck of the Princess. Chen Chongqing flew to Qin Chuan with a smile and gave Qin Chuan a big hug. "Boss, I missed you so much." Qin Chuan sensed Chen Chongqing's aura and said in surprise, "You've already reached the Dongshu stage." Chen Chongqing, who was already at the early Dongshu stage, nodded vigorously and said, "Yes, I'm now a powerful cultivator at the early Dongshu stage, ha ha ha." Qin Chuan was very surprised. It had only been half a year since Chen Chongqing left the land of exile and came to the outside world, but Chen Chongqing had already reached the early Dongshu stage. This speed was even faster than his own at the beginning. Yao Rao, who was standing to the side, smiled and said, "I'm also at the Dongshu stage." Hearing this, Qin Chuan subconsciously sensed Yao Rao's aura and was shocked to find that Yao Rao was already at the middle Dongshu stage, even higher than Chen Chongqing. "How did you do it?" Qin Chuan was very puzzled. Whether it was Chen Chongqing or Yao Rao, their cultivation speed was really too fast. "Actually, I have to thank you for being able to reach the middle Dongshu stage so quickly." Yao Rao looked at Qin Chuan and said, "Do you still remember that phoenix feather you gave me in the unfettered secret territory? I obtained the phoenix true blood and phoenix inheritance from it." Before leaving the land of exile, Yao Rao's bloodline had already undergone transformation and evolution. But because of the suppression of the special world law of the land of exile, her strength had always been suppressed. Now that she came to the outside world, her strength was no longer suppressed, so her strength had advanced by leaps and bounds. It could be said that she had accumulated a lot of strength. As for Chen Chongqing, although he didn't inherit any bloodline, but he had relied on his hard work to climb to his current realm. The sweat he had paid was absolutely the most among all of them. "We heard that you were injured, very seriously." Yao Rao looked at Qin Chuan and asked, "Is it serious?" Qin Chuan shook his head and said, "Thank you for your concern, but I am already fine. This is for you." Yao Rao handed over a small bottle to Qin Chuan. "You have already eaten it." Qin Chuan looked at the small bottle handed over by Yao Rao, and the expression on his face became somewhat complicated, and said, "This is too precious. You wouldn't have said this before." Yao Rao casually threw the small bottle to Qinchuan and said, "Take this as a thank you gift for leading our demon race to return to the universe and protecting our demon race's smooth development." Qinchuan caught the small bottle, and seriously said to Yao Rao, "Thank you. No need to thank me, we are friends." Yao Rao smiled, and said, "Also, this time we have brought a total of 40 million people from both demon and human race." Qinchuan was somewhat surprised hearing this, and said, "Why did you bring so many people?" Yao Rao deeply looked at Qinchuan and said, "Everyone signed up voluntarily, we didn't force you. You have already done enough, we don't have any reason to make you bleed and sacrifice in front of us. If we don't experience some wind and rain, then we will be like flowers in a greenhouse. How can we truly grow up?" Chapter 1266. All along, Qinchuan had believed that what he did was right, and what he gave to everyone was the best. From the opportunity to leave the banished land, to the brand new capital of 7, and then to the supply of various cultivation resources and daily living resources, to pave the way for everyone's future life, and so on. But after hearing Yao Rao's words, Qinchuan suddenly realized that what he gave to everyone was merely the best and most suitable thing. As a matter of fact, it wasn't what everyone really needed. Everyone was human race or monster race, everyone was an independent individual, with their own thoughts, and their own meaning of existence. Now they were the center of attention from all walks of life. On one hand, it was because human race and monster race had returned to the universe, which in itself was a big news worthy of attention, and on the other hand, it was because of Qinchuan. Qinchuan's strength was well known, and Qinchuan's protection of human race and monster race was also clear to everyone. Now human race and monster race were more like shackles on Qinchuan's body, rather than two races in the universe. They were very grateful to Qinchuan for giving them this opportunity to return to the universe, but they absolutely didn't want to be labeled as Qinchuan's weakness for their entire life. They wanted to stand up, rely on their own ability to obtain respect and win appreciation. For them, this was how human race and monster race should truly rise again. If they continued to rely on Qinchuan, then they would never be able to truly stand up. After hearing Yao Rao's words, Qinchuan remained silent for a very long time, and also thought about many things. Finally he smiled and asked Yao Rao and Chen Chongxing, "Are you really prepared?" Hearing Qinchuan, Chen Chongxing no longer had a mischievous smile, rather solemnly nodded and said, "We are prepared." Yao Rao also nodded and said, "If we weren't prepared, then we wouldn't have come here and said those words to you." Hearing Chen Chongxing and Yao Rao's answer, Qinchuan heavily patted their shoulders and said, "Good. I will treat you equally, and give you the opportunity to go to the battlefield. Use your blood to rebuild your glory." When Qinchuan gave Tian San the command of 40 million soldiers, Tian San was a little surprised. Others may not know much about the situation of the human clan and the demon clan, but Tian San clearly knew that the total population of the human clan and the demon clan was only about 400 million. 40 million soldiers should be the limit of the human clan and the demon clan. Once these 40 million soldiers were lost on the battlefield, it would be a great blow to the human clan and the demon clan. It could even be said that their vitality would be greatly damaged. Originally Tian San had thought that this was the request of Qinchuan to let human clan and demon clan obtain the recognition of various forces, but after knowing that this was the decision made by Chen Chongxing and Yao Rao, Tian San felt deep veneration for Chen Chongxing and Yao Rao. In the situation where they could obviously stay safely in the rear, Chen Chongxing and Yao Rao instead decided to lead the fighting power of the human clan and the demon clan to rush to Io Star Cloud. On the contrary, other forces were obviously in a desperate situation, but they were still scheming against each other. The disparity was simply like heaven and earth. With such determined people, even if there was no Qinchuan, the rise of the human clan and the demon clan would also be a matter of time. End of the year 1459 of the universe calendar. The center of the Deus cluster, the only continent which symbolized the supreme divine authority of the one God religion had fallen, and the only cathedral was destroyed. The rule of the one God religion in the Deus cluster had officially come to an end. Henceforth, the Deus cluster had become the spoils of war of Demon Clan, Zerg and Void Empire. And after seizing the Deus cluster, although Demon Clan, Zerg and Void Empire didn't immediately launch an attack on the Celestial cluster, they jointly issued an ultimatum to the various forces gathered in Io Star Cloud. Demon Clan, Zerg and Void Empire demanded the allied forces to hand over the remnants of the one God religion and the Void race. If the allied forces were unwilling to hand over the remnants of the one God religion and the Void race, then Demon Clan, Zerg and Void Empire would launch an attack on the Celestial cluster. Tian San scoffed at this ultimatum, which had no room for negotiation. Faced with such a simple tactic of sowing discord, even a fool wouldn't be fooled. Therefore, as the temporary supreme commander of the allied forces, Tian San responded without any trace of politeness. If you want people, then come fight yourselves. Now, nearly 3.5 billion troops had gathered in Io Star Cloud. The entire Io Star Cloud had entered a state of wartime administration. All civilians had been evacuated from Io Star Cloud and relocated to other places to settle down. On this day, the second day after the Demon Clan issued the ultimatum, Tian San gathered the representatives of various forces in the Allied forces in the name of Tian people and held the first collective meeting after the establishment of the Allied forces. The representatives of various forces arrived at the conference room half an hour before the meeting time. Qinchuan also arrived, but he didn't sit in the hall of the conference room. The person representing the human clan was Chun Chongxing, and the representative of the demon clan was naturally Yaorao. Qinchuan sat in the corner of the second floor, looking down at the hall below, and said to Thelon, who was sitting beside him, "You've been very quiet recently." Hearing Qinchuan's words, Thelon pursed his lips and said, "There are too many bad memories in Io Star Cloud." At that time, the Tian people's 200 million troops were lost in Io Star Cloud. Heavenly King Oliver also fell in Io Star Cloud. Now that he came to Io Star Cloud again, it was inevitable that Thelon's mood would be somewhat affected. Qinchuan sighed and said, "I can see that you and Sharmilla have suffered a great blow because of the fall of Heavenly King Oliver." The originally lively and cheerful Sharmilla had now become a reserved and taciturn person. Thelon had also changed from the originally confident prince to a silent loner. Even though Qinchuan was sitting beside Thelon at this time, he couldn't integrate into Thelon's world. After experiencing the previous blow, Thelon had now broken through to the late unity stage. If it was in the past, Thelon might be very happy, but when he thought of the powerful guru, he couldn't smile. He wanted to avenge Heavenly King Oliver, but the gap between him and his enemy was simply too big. Qinchuan stretched out his hand and patted Thelon's shoulder, saying, "Trust me, Guru won't be killed so early. You still have time and many opportunities." Hearing Qinchuan's words, Thelon couldn't help but look at Qinchuan with a subtle expression. Qinchuan's perspective was really very novel. This was the first time he saw someone comforting others like this. "In the coming war, I will definitely kill Guru with my own hands." Thelon looked at Qinchuan with an unprecedentedly serious expression. Chapter 1267. The moderately sized conference hall was filled with representatives from 176 different forces. The strongest among them was at the pinnacle of the combination stage, while the weakest was only at the perfect apotheosis stage. The Tian people had mobilized the most troops, with a total of over 2 billion soldiers. The frogmen had mobilized the least troops, with a total of 4 million soldiers. All the forces present today had already viewed the demon faction, which was formed by the Nephilim, Zerg, and the Void Empire, as their mortal enemy. Even the representatives of the Bronzes and Oilmen, who had been bullied by Qin had realized that the demon faction's ambition could never be satisfied. Now that the Deus cluster had fallen, the demon faction had turned their spearhead to the celestial cluster. If the celestial cluster fell, the demon faction would definitely not be able to escape. Therefore, if they wanted to protect their race and their families, they had to take up arms and fight to the end. Tian San looked at the representatives of the other 175 forces and said in a clear voice, "Everyone who should be here should be here." Hearing Tian San's words, all the representatives looked around. Originally, Io had gathered more than 190 factions. However, due to the ultimatum issued by the demon faction, 15 factions had chosen to withdraw from the war and settle down in a corner of the planet. These 15 forces were all small forces and were not particularly important to the alliance. However, their withdrawal had inevitably shaken the resolve of the other forces. Therefore, Tian San would definitely do something about the withdrawal of these 15 forces. From today onwards, the Celestial Cluster will not allow the members of these 15 forces to enter the Celestial Cluster. Furthermore, the members of these 15 forces will be expelled from the alliance. We will cut off all business dealings with these 15 forces and will never be friends again. Hearing Tian San's words, the faces of the people present turned serious. For the 15 forces that had withdrawn from the alliance, the punishment of the Tian people was too harsh. This was especially true for those who had been living in the Celestial Cluster for many years. Once they were expelled, they would definitely be dissatisfied with their families and might even cause some riot. However, this was not the key point. The key point was that if they lost the opportunity to communicate with powerful forces like the Tian people, the development of these 15 forces would definitely stagnate or even regress. Now, if there is anyone who does not want to offend the demon faction and wants to withdraw from this war, you may stand up and leave. Tian San looked around the room and said in a cold voice, "If you go back on your words after this meeting, you will become the enemy of my celestial clan. Before we have a decisive battle with the demon faction, my celestial clan will get rid of these traitors." Hearing Tian San's words, all the representatives in the hall sat up straight. If they withdrew from the alliance at this time, they would lose their lives before they could even walk out of the conference hall. Tian San glanced at the people around him and said, "Since no one wants to withdraw, let's start the meeting." After the meeting began, the first thing that Tian San had to do was to decide on the name of the Alliance Army. Currently, the Alliance Army was known as the Righteous Alliance, which was the symbol of the demon faction. There were also some who simply called it the Alliance Army. In Tian San's opinion, if everyone wanted to unite, they must first have a common name. So it was very important to decide the name of the demon faction. As for the name Demon Alliance, it was also given to the Nephilim race by someone else. The Nephilim race would never admit that they were evil. On behalf of the Tian people, I propose that the demon faction be officially named the Endless Alliance. Tian San looked at the people present and said, "Endless means that the united power of the demon faction is endless. As long as we work together, we can defeat the demon faction. Endless alliance, endless power, endless passion, endless justice." These were the meanings of the name Endless and the meaning of the demon faction. Hearing Tian San's words, everyone nodded to show their approval of the name. From now on, they were no longer the commander of the Oil Tribe or the commander of the Bronze Tribe. They were members of the Endless Alliance. Seeing that most of the people nodded to show their approval, Tian San proposed to raise his hand. Unsurprisingly, the name of the Endless Alliance was approved unanimously. The second thing I want to talk about is the command of the demon faction. Tian San looked at the people present and said, although the Tian people and the Protoss are the initiators of the Endless Alliance, it doesn't mean that we will be the supreme commander of the Endless Alliance. Now that everyone has united and become a community of interests, we should choose a person who can convince everyone to be the supreme commander of the Endless Alliance. The representatives of the various forces were extremely surprised when they heard Tian San's words. No one had thought that Tian San would actually spit out the title of Supreme Commander. However, although this action was surprising, it had successfully won the hearts of the people. If the Tian people could directly decide the Supreme Commander, it would be very difficult for these people to find a sense of belonging in the Endless Alliance. Seeing the reactions of the people, Tian San knew that he had made the right move. He clapped his hands and motioned for the people to be quiet. Then he said, "Now we have a total of 3 nominees. The first one is me, Tian San, the third elder of the Tian people's elder compound. I am at the peak of the combination realm." The people were not surprised by Tian San's nomination. After all, Tian San was the representative of the Tian people. More than half of the troops in the Endless Alliance came from the Tian people. Tian San deserved to be nominated. The second nominee is Pope Baudolo of the One God religion. He is one of the strongest people in the Endless Alliance. He is at the Crossing Calamity stage. Baudolo's advancement to the Crossing Calamity stage had always been a secret. Now that it was exposed, everyone was very shocked and there was an uproar. However, as a veteran powerhouse, the matter of Baudolo's advancement to the Crossing Calamity stage was still under investigation. "Well, everyone be quiet," Tian San said to the people. "The third nominee is the commander of the Desolate Tribe, Huang Feng. As a tyrant second only to the top 10 ancient tribes, the Desolate Tribe was the first force to contact the Tian people and was willing to join the Endless Alliance. It had always been a staunch pro-war faction. As the commander of the Desolate Tribe and an overlord at the peak of the combination realm, Huang Feng deserved to be nominated. Regarding this, the representatives of the various forces were not surprised. After all, the Desolate Tribe was very strong. This time, in order to fight against the demon faction, they had sent 300 million soldiers and 12 overlords at the combination realm. The fact that Huang Feng could get a nomination showed that the Endless Alliance was a fair and just organization. This time, the representatives of the various forces felt a sense of belonging to the Endless Alliance. Chapter 1268. After announcing the 3 nominations, Tian San fell silent. After about a minute, he spoke again. "Now, I'll give everyone 5 minutes to think about this matter. After 5 minutes, we'll vote. Everyone only has 1 vote and no more vote." As soon as Tian San's voice fell, the quiet conference hall instantly became noisy again. All the representatives were whispering to each other to discuss the voting matters. As the nominee, Saint Baudolo was sitting quietly in his seat, not saying a word. Huang Feng was the same, but he was even more extreme. He had temporarily shut off his hearing, not wanting to communicate with others. He didn't even want to listen to voice transmissions. Tian San was looking at his watch, seriously counting down the time. He didn't seem to care about the final results of the voting. For the representatives of the other factions, this was a rather difficult choice. The first nomination belonged to Tian San. Tian San was the representative of the Tian people, and the Tian people had more than 2 billion soldiers in the Endless Allied Army. They were the absolute core of the Endless Allied Army. It was a very good choice for Tian San to be the supreme commander of the Endless Allied Army. As for the Pope, Saint Baudolo, he was a supreme existence in the tribulation stage. He was the strongest person in the Endless Allied Army, and was also a very good choice. As for the Desolate Race's commander, Huang Feng, He was the strongest representative of the small and medium-sized factions. If Huang Feng was the supreme commander, their interests might be guaranteed to the greatest extent. Overall, these three nominees were very good choices. The 5-minute discussion ended very quickly. When Tian-san asked the 174 representatives present who were not participating in the election to vote, Huang Feng suddenly stood up. "Wait a minute, I have something to say." Everyone looked at Huang Feng with puzzled eyes. Huang Feng's expression was normal, and he said calmly, "I propose that my nomination be given to Qinchuan." As Huang Feng's voice fell, everyone present was stunned. Qinchuan, who was sitting on the second floor, was even more surprised. He was here to watch the show, so why was he suddenly called out? In the face of everyone's surprise, Huang Feng said calmly, "Qinchuan's performance at the front lines of the dais cluster is obvious to all. Even those who haven't seen it with their own eyes should have heard of it." Facing Qinchuan, the demons suffered defeat after defeat. First, the demon King Phantom was repelled by Qinchuan. Later, Qinchuan led the frontline soldiers to escape from the hands of Prince Fro. Whether it is strength or reputation, he is the most suitable candidate. When everyone heard Huang Feng's words, a thoughtful look appeared on their faces. Although what Huang Feng said was true, and Qinchuan was indeed very popular, was Huang Feng really willing to give up this nomination? Just as everyone was thinking about this, Huang Feng continued, "I know that everyone must be thinking that I received some benefits or that I was threatened. In fact, none of these things happened. Everything I said was from the bottom of my heart. I just want to ask everyone, don't you want the supreme commander of our endless allied forces to be someone who is powerful, capable, and benevolent at the same time?" When he spoke up to this point, Huang Feng paused for a moment and then he continued, "If I were to face Fu, then to be honest, I would definitely choose to flee by myself. Because I don't have the courage to face a tribulation overlord by myself." Huang Feng's last sentence caused an extremely subtle change in everyone's expression. If they were to face Fro, they would probably make the same choice as Huang Feng. In this way, Qinchuan was even more extraordinary. I also have something to say. At this moment, Saint Baudelaire suddenly stood up and attracted everyone's attention. I'm sure everyone has heard about the enmity between the One God religion and Qinchuan. If there's anyone in this world who wishes for the One God religion to lead a bad life, I think one of them must be Qinchuan. Saint Baudelaire pursed his lips and said, "But I was wrong. Qinchuan is a selfless person." When the dais cluster was under great pressure at the front line and was in the most dangerous situation, Qinchuan took the initiative to go to the front line and join the revolutionary army. He led the frontline troops to successive victories and successfully resisted the Nephilim race, buying enough time for the dais cluster. In the end, he even led the remaining tinder of the One God religion to escape from Fro's clutches, preserving hope for the One God religion to rebuild. Qinchuan is worthy of everyone's trust. I'm willing to give my nomination to Qinchuan. When everyone heard Saint Baudelaire's words, their expressions became extremely interesting. No one expected that a person who had not appeared in the nomination list would be recommended by two nominees in succession. In that case, isn't it inappropriate for me to monopolize this nomination? Tian-san chuckled and said to everyone, "The Pope and Huang Feng are right. Everyone has seen Qinchuan's performance. What do you think about Qinchuan being the supreme commander of our endless allied forces?" As Tian-san's voice fell, two loud voices of approval sounded at the scene. "I agree." Qinchuan raised his arm high, showing great enthusiasm. Yao Rao said faintly, "In terms of strength, wisdom, and human nature, Qinchuan is the most suitable candidate. My monster race second the motion." Saint Baudelaire smiled and said, "The One God religion second the motion. The desolate race second the motion. The Tian people second the motion. The Naga race second the motion. The Bronze race second the motion." As more and more voices of approval sounded, the majority of the forces present expressed their approval for Qin Chuan to be the supreme commander of the front line. 176 votes, all passed. Hey, did you ask for my opinion? Qin Chuan sat on the railing on the second floor, scratching his head, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. It wasn't that he was taking advantage of the situation, but that when these people made this decision, they didn't ask for his opinion at all. Tian San looked up at Qin Chuan, chuckled, and said, Qin Chuan. No, now I should call you Marshal Qin. Marshal Qin, do you have anything to say? Facing everyone's gazes, Qin Chuan smiled and said, I just want to know if all of you are sincere in wanting me to be the supreme commander. Let me say this first, if anyone disobeys my orders and goes against me, I will be punished by military law. In other words, before I make a major mistake, you are not qualified to question any of my decisions. If you don't say anything, I will take it as your consent. The response to Qin Chuan was a long silence. Everyone tacitly agreed with Qin Chuan's words. Seeing this, Qin Chuan grinned and said, Then, from now on, I am your Marshal Qin. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.